Hello, you're listening to the Eric McKenna Project.
Abductions, James.
Let's do it.
Abductions, I know. So, the most famous abduction book to me, it actually was exposed to me as a child. Yeah, I'll admit it. I think someone in my family had it. I might have peeked at it once or twice. But it was also had a religious connotation too. So the marketing of that book was fabulously on time.
Yep.
In the early '80s, right? Communion.
Yes.
Whitley Strieber.
Yeah.
I have not read the book from start to finish. I've read pieces of it, and I've read reviews of it, so I've gone backwards in attacking it.
Right.
But what is the gist of that book, and why was it so monumental?
Well, first off, it has the most terrifying book cover I've ever seen. Have you guys all seen the book cover to it?
No.
It's just got this classic gray alien that Strieber's friend painted at his loft somewhere, and even this, just the book cover gave me nightmares. But what was interesting about the Strieber case is I think he was really the first well-known person to come forward about an abduction experience, because prior to that, nobody really knew any of these people, and so it was a lot easier for skeptics to say, well, they're just making it up for fame. But Strieber was actually a published author, and he had an apartment in New York City, but then he also had a log cabin in upstate New York. And I believe the date of the abduction was December 26, 1986. So
day after Christmas.
Yeah. So he and his family, wife and kid, happy marriage, no issues, anything like that. They had a great Christmas.
Okay.
And he recalled going to bed and basically waking up and hearing like a rustling sound downstairs, like a whole lot of people were moving around. And he basically sat in bed. And what I found interesting was he just allowed himself to go back to sleep. He sort of passed it off. And a common theme in a lot of these experiences, even with UFO sightings with people that I interview, is the logical side of your brain wants to kick in and just explain it away. So a lot of people see wild stuff and initially they dismiss it. But Strieber tried to get back to sleep, and then he knew something was dangerously awry when he saw his closet door basically pulling inwards. And so he recalled basically seeing what we would now consider like a classic gray alien in his room. And I remember reading it, and in a way, he doesn't really embellish it, but it's still terrifying. He recalled basically being outside of his house, and there was a fresh blanket of about 8 inches of snow on the ground. But then there was this one big circle on the ground that had no snow at all. And he said there was basically a being sitting there, and he almost sensed like boredom from the being. Like it was basically just the daily job that these guys were having to do. And then he recalled basically being taken up into this craft. And so the book became very famous because he gave a very, very vivid description of his abduction account. And he ended up going through what we would call hypnotic regression.
Right.
And then he found out, like a lot of abductees do, that he had previous experiences prior to that as sort of a missing time.
So, like, can I ask a quick question? Because, like, is that a common theme in abductions, is that, you know, it's like one person is like chosen and they get revisited throughout their life?
That's a phenomenal question, Julia. Okay. It seems to be that way. Okay. And what's interesting is a lot of people...
That explains Fred.
He was abducted by the rock and roll aliens.
Come by the tour bus and pick me up.
But a lot of people, when they think it happens, if they remember anything about it, they think it's just this fluke event. But if they actually decide to go through hypnotic regression, and a lot of people surprisingly don't, they don't want to recall anything about what happened. But for those that do, they tend to remember previous events. Even with MUFON, just a little background for people that didn't listen to episode 125 with Eric and I am a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, and we don't get a lot of abduction accounts, but I have dealt with a few, and sometimes it doesn't even actually start as an abduction account. A person just thinks that they've had a UFO sighting. But as you talk to them and get to know them, They then mention, well, yeah, a couple years ago I had this one. Then I remember this one night as a kid, this happened. And so you end up seeing for a lot of these people, it's a lot more of a pattern than they might realize.
Interesting. Huh.
Just terrifying.
I know, honestly, like I'm so much more comfortable with like the thought of like paranormal, like,
Right.
you know, spiritual kind of stuff than I am like the idea of like being abducted by an alien gives me the deepest heebie-jeebies that like, I can
Oh, absolutely.
Well, Hollywood's glorified everything too, but that did the concept. It couldn't have been the concept of how we view aliens: small, gray, skinny, big heads, little bodies. Did that come from that book, or was that Hollywood decades prior?
That's a phenomenal question. It seems like the notion of the gray alien actually came in around the late 70s or early 80s.
Okay.
Because if you look back prior to that, we want to talk 1950s, 60s, the term abductees wasn't really around yet. It was more experiencer. So people that had alien encounters back then, you can probably see the visual pretty well. They tended to be more friendly. They also tended to be during the daytime, and it wasn't actually the image of the gray alien. It became known as what people dubbed the Nordic alien. So very human-like, tall, blonde, beautiful. And most of them seem to be more interested in collecting flora and fauna, almost like a biologist. So people would actually describe just driving their car, and suddenly they see this silver-shaped ship sitting there in the middle of a meadow. And so the interactions were personable. The being supposedly spoke English, and their primary focus was warning humans about the dangers of nuclear proliferation. So
And this was in the 50s?
This was 50s into the 60s. So
Okay.
finally around the late 70s, early 80s, that's more replaced with the classic and terrifying gray alien abduction experience, which is a lot more frightening, a lot less personable. And it seems like in these cases, the beings, if they're real, are more interested in collecting human biological samples. And so I can see it from both sides. There's a chance that we really did have one race, one civilization here trying to help us. But after they were repeatedly rebuffed and ignored, they essentially put their hands up and said, okay, we're out. And then you have this more menacing civilization that enters for their own means and ends. But there's also the flip side. Skeptically, you could say, well, look at how movies go. Back in the 50s and 60s, if you wanted to make an alien in a movie, you basically had to take a human and dress him or her up in an alien suit. So not surprisingly, aliens from that time period look more human-like.
Maybe we're taller.
Yeah, exactly. But then, you know, starting in the 80s into the 90s, you had the advent of CG. You can make aliens look however you want to make them look. And then the real wild card, before I turn it back to you guys, there have been a number of abduction accounts that actually feature both types of extraterrestrials, where people will actually report that the Greys seem more like the worker bees, essentially, like an intergalactic Red Cross that are just there to basically take these samples, do what they're supposed to do, and then sort of in the background, like the shadowy recesses of the ships, they can basically see these taller, blonde Nordic aliens directing the show. So there's a lot of twists and turns to this.
The reason I asked about the history of the human conception of an alien is obviously Roswell, little people, right?
Yes.
The little thing. But there wasn't a real good description of the body out of Roswell, or was there?
Well,
Corso,
eventually there was. The issue with Roswell that a lot of people don't realize in hindsight is it was covered up so quickly after the military bumbled for a day or two that even though that happened in 47, a lot of people didn't even know about Roswell until 79, 80 when Stanton Friedman starts to really blow it up. So even though you're exactly right, that was the eventual description, I don't think it actually influenced this earlier imagery of gray aliens.
What did Philip Corso say about because he was he commenting on what he saw, the wreckage of that?
He did. And so a quick plug, Eric and I talked about in last episode, did any of you ever read The Day After Roswell?
No.
Oh, it's phenomenal. So it's with Phil Corso and Bill Burns, who you see a lot on the History Channel, UFO Hunters. And what was interesting, just to give your watchers or listeners the backstory, basically Philip Corso was very well connected. This was a man in Army intelligence that shows up in almost every seminal event from the 50s, 60s. Like, he even ended up tied into researching the Kennedy assassination. And so Corso's whole premise is he was basically in charge of taking that technology from the Roswell crash and basically seeding it into private industry so that they could better develop. So to your question, Eric, he did not actually work with the alien bodies per se, but he did mention earlier in the book, I believe he was stationed in Kansas at the time, and he actually went into a hangar where the rumor was that they had a lot of material that was saved there from the Roswell crash, that they were gradually moving east to Wright-Patterson in Ohio, home of the legendary Hangar 18. And he actually had the authority to peek inside some of the wooden crates, and that's where he supposedly saw one or two of the cadavers from the Roswell crash.
How did he describe them?
He described them very similar to what we would think of as a gray alien today. There were some details you don't always see. I believe he said there was webbing between the fingers and the toes.
I always hear that too, that like the webbing, and that there's just like kind of like more scaly or something. Like that the skin's like tougher. Like,
and people even describe it as almost reptilian, or if their hand is held, they say it's cold to the touch. And so Corso actually worked, and I only know this because I was actually, one of my former students had actually dated his grandson for a while.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that wild?
Small world.
Yeah. And so I got to see a lot of his first person writings that never really got published. And he had this phenomenal paper that I don't think was ever published in any of his books. And he basically had 3 columns. He had human column, he had gray alien column, and then he had a third column. And basically his take was, these were not actual purely organic biological entities.
I've heard that before too, that it was like that they like have like speculated that a lot of the beings that are oftentimes, you know, observed in these different encounters are more like created for travels, essentially.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And like sort of like being like directed by somewhere else,
like
or someone
part machine
else.
Like, I'm confused. Like, what do you mean?
Yes.
That they're like using like biological material to create like almost like drivers essentially for like the crafts. Is that right?
Julia is exactly right. And so it's
I told you I would do research for this.
Part biological, part machine. And the premise is basically space travel is really, really tough on the human body.
For sure.
You've got radiation, you've got extended periods of microgravity. And so NASA is already working on robotic prototypes. So the idea is, if another civilization is a couple centuries or a couple millennium ahead of us, these beings could have essentially been designed for the sole purpose of this travel. And as Julia alluded to, basically they could be controlled from afar. Usually with grays, you see the concept of a hive mentality, where some abductees describe if something actually goes wrong on the abduction that's out of the ordinary, initially the grays don't know how to actually react to that because they're just programmed. They can't just react to things like we do. So kind of a neat concept.
So then my question, going back to like the other alien forms, is like, was the same mentality applied there? And also, like, isn't there multiple types of like alien races that have been like reported? Not, I think the grays are the ones that we're familiar with, and then the one that you're describing from like the 50s.
Yes.
But aren't there like a whole bunch of them in between there too?
The reptilians.
Yes. That's a great question. There are a few common ones we could rattle off. You've got the short grays, the tall grays. You've got the Nordics, the reptilians, and that one's a little bit of a twist. Some ask, are they really from outer space? Or some believe, are they really the first civilization that was here? Real quick side story, one creepy display, I forget which Smithsonian it was in, but they basically showed a concept of what would Earth be like if the dinosaur extinction never actually happened. And they basically showed tall lizard people wearing clothes, having spears, because the dinosaur extinction, even though that was sad, that basically opened up the niche for us mammals to come on the scene.
Yeah, because there's no way we could have like coexisted.
Right. So one theory is basically that some of them did survive and evolve. You kind of see that theory thrown around with the Loch Ness Monster. But another theory is, if life evolves similarly on other planets, maybe there's another planet that was like ours, but they don't have the dinosaur extinction. So there you actually get this more advanced reptilian form. You've got robots also that are in some abductions, just actually talk about beings being more robotic. And then you even have some that are more spiritual, where they actually talk about beings of light.
Like interdimensional beings.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you've got, to your point, you've got interdimensional, you've got ultra-dimensional. So one of the theories is it's a mistake to think all these aliens are from outer space. Some of them are essentially right here at basically like a higher vibrational
different
level.
dimension.
Exactly. Yeah. So
That's like, did you go, and this is a total sidebar, and you'll appreciate this because this was on a Tool album. When they did, like, it was like, do you know what I'm talking about?
Looking right
yes,
to Fred.
Yes. So, like, it's like this, like, little interlude, and it was on, oh, gosh, what was the guy's name? It was on some show. It was like a radio show, and, like, this caller called in, and she was talking about Area 51, and she's
Art
like,
Bell.
Yes!
Art
Thank
Bell.
you.
Yes.
Oh, shit.
There goes the hairdo. Pause for hair break.
Sorry, no, well, like, I literally got so excited because my grandmother used to listen to Art Bell. She loved him.
It was all
And
midnight to 6 in the morning or something. Was it?
Yeah.
was that Coast to Coast AM?
Yes,
Coast to
yes,
Coast.
yes. But so this lady or guy called. No, it was a guy. He called in, and it's the recordings on a Tool album, and he's going like something. They're not aliens as we think they are. They're interdimensional beings, and then all of a sudden, like the Art Bell show, the radio just stops, and they'd never been bumped off air before.
I remember that story.
Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah. That was. Do you remember that? Do you remember what album it was?
I don't.
Me either.
But you know what's interesting is even some of the science community documentaries on parallel universes and the physics end of it, which
Right.
you're well versed in, they will even go that direction and say, hey, if the dinosaurs had not been extinct, because that's where the whole reptile wearing a suit was part of this the science program I just watched, where that was the logical step.
Yeah, it's interesting because for decades the scientific community has sort of poo-pooed all of this, especially like the New Age type works where they're talking about higher dimensions. But now physics is basically coming in from the back end. Big development there, I think, was probably string theory
No
or
question.
Yes.
superstring theory,
No question.
because one of the premises is there's at least 17 dimensions out there. Now, according to like the current version of string theory, most of the dimensions are teeny tiny, rolled up so tight we can't see them, but they've at least got the idea now of other dimensions. So it is kind of neat how you've got the ufology and New Age side. Eventually, it really does synthesize with the science physics side, even though it can take a couple decades to do so.
I think quantum mechanics, I think, was that not discovered. I guess there's discovery within quantum mechanics, but it actually became a field of study. I want to say it was the early 1900s, right?
You're right. That was actually early 19 teens. Einstein put out 4 different papers.
Right.
And the 2 biggest ones basically focused around special relativity.
Right.
But one of his papers was actually about quantum mechanics, or it led to
spooky actions from a distance.
spooky action at a distance.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so but I'm saying that whole world of quantum mechanics is that I find it funny because with the physics, it's almost like it's a great catch-all for anyone in physics, because if they don't know,
Right.
well, there's quantum mechanics, we don't know what's going on over here.
Right.
Yeah.
To the layman like myself, it looks as like they have like an excuse for everything, because
Right.
if they don't know, they just,
Yeah.
Well,
we don't understand it.
I mean, for any viewers or listeners that don't know about quantum mechanics, it is very complex, but the basic deal of it is it comes from the term quanta. So in the early 1900s, basically most physicists thought light was just a wave, and Einstein was able to show that's basically a particle, tiny particles called quanta, and a wave at the same time. And so it leads this field of quantum study, and the basic premise is on the level of the very, very teeny tiny, you can't always make predictions, and things are not always in exact points. They can be multiple places at the same time until an observation is made.
That's the crux of it.
Well, and then
That blows
isn't it like
minds.
whenever they started really like doing some of this research, they found that like the intent of the like whenever they're like running experiments, sometimes like the intent of the experiment affects the outcome.
well, if you observe
Yes.
it.
Yeah, exactly. Like just
Because
your
a
observation
a
alone.
photon can be a particle and a wave simultaneously.
Yes.
Whether you're basically, it is determined by whether it's being measured or not.
You're exactly right. Yeah, Eric tries to play it off like, I don't know that much about science. He's always on point. He's always
physics,
good.
I'm fascinated by physics.
Right. Yeah, and that was you had mentioned spooky action at a distance, and spooky action is pretty wild because the potential was basically there for faster than light travel. So the idea of it was basically a big debate in physics, probably back in the 40s or 50s, is you basically have two particles that are entangled with each other, and then they split off and go in different directions.
Niels Bohr?
Niels Bohr was definitely part of it. He had some good throwdowns with Einstein. The whole idea basically came up. Einstein brought it up almost in jest to challenge some of the physicists who were going against him. One of the problems with Einstein, as smart and brilliant as he was, he would also basically get himself deeply entrenched into certain positions and not want to budge from them.
Rigid, right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so they basically...
Wouldn't you be if you were that damn smart?
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's where you run into like all kinds of issues with, you know, things like this. As soon as like new evidence is unveiled, you're kind of like, well, how do I look at all of this other research that I've done? And
and it wasn't that initially the issue with string theory, because it was just really string theory was attacked, and the gentleman's name escapes me now.
Well, there's Michio Kaku is one of the leading proponents of it.
But who wrote 80s Witten? I can't remember his name. The issue is that string theory was really attacked when it first really became mainstream, wasn't it?
Well, any time in science that anybody puts anything out there different than the mainstream, it's going to get attacked. Okay. So string theory is pretty wild. It is overall very accepted now. The overall premise is basically there are more dimensions than we know, and large-scale structures in the universe, even though we perceive them as point-like, they could actually be big vibrating strings.
Right.
And so the idea is really awesome, but so far, at least, we don't have a lot of direct observational evidence of it.
Still, even to this day. So it's still very theoretical.
Oh, so are things like dark energy and dark matter. That's what kind of blows my mind.
So is gravity, right? Gravity is still technically a theory, but I mean, we see evidence of it all around us.
Gravitons have been confirmed. I mean, we're getting close to defining it, I think.
I mean, I'm not saying I don't believe in gravity. I'm just saying.
Right.
Gravity always wins.
Right.
Yeah, for like every time I fall on my ass.
Right. Well, you know, they're always trying to redefine gravity. So far, the best interpretation still goes back to Einstein in 1917. He does general relativity, and the basic gist is gravity is basically a result of the curvature of space-time. So if we have the sun, Newton would have said that planets orbit around the sun because the sun has a gravitational pull, and he wasn't wrong, but Einstein would basically say, think about the fabric of space-time like a big, thin rubber sheet. And the sun is basically like a bowling ball that you would throw into the middle. So it would basically warp that fabric, and then the planets would be like smaller little marbles basically rolling around that warp. So that's as close as we've come. And so far, general relativity is one of the most proven and reproven theories out there, but it also doesn't seem entirely complete. Some of our space probes that have gone really far, like the Voyagers and Pioneers, it gets to the point where they aren't exactly where we predict they should be. It's a little bit off. And so it's somewhat incomplete. And then to what you had mentioned, Eric, some physicists are actually looking for a gravity particle out there, because basically everything else on the subatomic level has a particle associated with it, and gravity does not. So
what is the graviton? Have they discovered the graviton?
Well, I think that's why I had mentioned it. I think the graviton is basically the idea that there is a subatomic particle that's actually out there.
Okay.
But it's not been like observed or pinpointed yet.
As far as I know, it is not. They're doing amazing work at the Cern particle collider in Switzerland, trying to find the God particle.
Yeah, I know. I read an article about that. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Even a bigger one, believe it or not.
That's wild. People already freaked out about the first one, thinking it would end the world.
But before CERN was completed, there was the most advanced particle accelerator before that in Fermilab. Was that right? Was it in Fermilab?
Outside of Chicago, there's a place called Fermilab, and I think that was probably the biggest one to date.
Because that's before CERN. I was familiar with Fermilab, and people were very very uncomfortable with that process,
Yes.
as small as that was in relative to how big CERN is today.
Yes. So the controversy with CERN was people were worried that they could make such an energetic collision that they would basically create a black hole that would
And
suck
on-
in your...
Yeah.
Wouldn't that have been
Yes.
awesome, though, just to see
No,
that?
no. When I was little, like space, like I was fascinated by it, but it terrified me. And like when I actually learned what a black hole was, like I could not. I mean, I'm you know, you're a kid, you're trying to like get your mind around all these enormous concepts,
Right.
and like I'm like, what do you mean? Like it's nothing. Like,
Right.
but it's not nothing. I get that, but like,
Right.
no, I don't think we should have those on Earth. Just
You want to make one this afternoon?
no, no, thanks.
Well, you know, some of the controversy was stemmed when a physicist came out, and I read the paper, is really good. He basically mathematically showed even if it did make a black hole, it would be teeny tiny and it would evaporate really fast. But there's still weird things with CERN. Like, I don't know if we talked about this on the last
We
show.
did. I don't think we did. We touched on it.
So right outside CERN, there is a statue of Shiva, the Indian goddess of destruction.
Right.
And so, so officially it was given to Switzerland by the government of India. But at the same time, if you build a massive facility that people are
Yeah.
worried is going to destroy the earth, probably best not to put a
Like another
statue of
statue.
Shiva, goddess
Shiva.
of destruction.
Or
and then
move it.
then the staff at CERN also really got people worked up because they basically dressed in dark robes
Right.
and had what amounted to a faux satanic ritual outside of CERN, which they then posted to YouTube. So they're definitely not helping things here.
Black metal's big over there. Right?
See, and then it's going to come full circle. They're going to be like having one more excuse to put metalheads back in the corner.
Right?
But they want to build another one, right? There's talk of building a larger one.
There's always talk about whether it's telescopes, particle accelerators, building bigger to uncover even more mysteries of the universe. And I think they probably will. One of the challenges, though, is we are talking about such minutia now, but we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars to build these facilities for a very small group of scientists. They're just looking
They
into
keep getting the funding.
They
Were you surprised the CERN was funded?
I wasn't surprised CERN was funded. It would surprise me if these bigger ones are funded, but it could happen. One quick side conspiracy on CERN. I don't know if you had heard this one. There's a side conspiracy, like a separate rabbit hole, that the world did really already end.
And we're already in the Matrix.
Yes, because
Simulation theory.
yeah, you're
yeah.
exactly
Uh-huh.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
You know,
Whoa. We're not going to gloss over this one. Okay, what is this exactly? Because I watched The Matrix, all three of them, multiple times, and I still don't get it.
Well, I mean, from what I know, and I actually mostly know this from, and I had an interest in it anyway because it's a philosophy that's like already been. I mean, it's an old philosophy. It's like I don't remember whose original it was, but like me and Jerry had this like little book that we kept on our coffee table, and that was one of the ideas. Is that basically, you know, the Matrix concept has existed forever. That we're all experiencing life like from somewhere. Like we're not here. Like our consciousness is bigger than all of this, and that this is just like an expression for us to interact and kind of like interface in, but this isn't actually where we exist. And in the Matrix, the idea is that, you know, we're little pods that are like, you know, basically batteries for a larger unit. And that's not entirely untrue from what I understand, but I heard about it again on Rogan whenever Elon Musk was on it.
Yeah.
Because he was talking, and then so like the way that it was explained there is that, you know, there's almost as much evidence to indicate that we are in fact in a simulation as that we're not. If you break it down on a scientific
Well, a
level.
lot of very astute physics scholars believe that, right? James, his last name's forgets, brilliant guy, but he's the one that believes that we might be part of a smear on the edge of the black hole. We're actually only 2 dimensions as opposed to 3, which that blows my mind. Is that right?
There's the simulation theory, and then closely related to that is that the universe is a hologram.
Okay.
And so a hologram.
I don't get that. I can't
Well,
grasp
that
this.
one's really tough. A hologram in its simplest form basically means you are expressing a higher number of dimensions in a lower number of dimensions. So think back to the early 90s when holographic video games came out, and that was supposed to be like the next big thing, and then it didn't end up being that. They were basically taking 3 dimensions and expressing that down in a flat 2-dimensional form in a hologram.
Okay.
So the idea here, which I think Julia was alluding to, is basically if we are higher dimensional, technically we're 4-dimensional if you count time, but if we're 5-dimensional, 6-dimensional is basically getting filtered down for us, and we have to go about living this 4-dimensional existence.
So we can comprehend it.
Yes, and that's also part of the reason potentially that UFO sightings seem so bizarre to people is some people believe if there are these multiple levels or frequencies working here, it's basically higher dimensional forms temporarily expressing themselves in our reality, which makes it look so odd and we have a tough time expressing it.
Wow. It's just
Well, if you think about like this is just like a, my own little way to understand it. If you look at, biologically what our eyes actually are, we're not seeing any of this. Like this is literally just like the structure inside our heads way of filtering light. And like none of these colors exist in physical space. They exist in your mind.
in reality.
Exactly. Like they only exist because I perceive them. You know
Now,
what
is
I
that
mean?
a theory or is that
No,
proven?
I'd say not only is that proven, but just to take that one step further, our eyes are so phenomenal. They're basically taking 2-dimensional sensory data, and then in our head, we're compiling that into the 3-dimensional reality that we have around us.
Right.
So, yeah, that's a really good call. Yeah.
Been rather quiet over there.
Yeah.
Taking it all in.
I knew you were going to say that too.
Taking it all
I mean,
in.
this is why I love talking with you, because we can go down that physics lane and we can go right back to abductions. But it blends together.
It does.
It really does blend together.
And I was nervous at the start of this because I definitely had to raise my physics game here because I can tell everybody here is knowledgeable. Can we do one more quick aside on what Julia brought up with that?
Absolutely.
One thing that's really sort of frightened me, and I brought this up at like a MUFON state meeting, and it led to a lot of good discussion in terms of the universe being a simulation. Have any of you heard of the computer game No Man's Sky?
No.
Here we go.
We've
You
got
had to tell him, didn't
Tons
you?
of homework
You
to do
had
now.
to, you had to tell
Write
him.
it
didn't
down now. No Man's Sky.
All right.
Well, let me at least give the premise for it. It came out probably 5 or 6 years ago, and the initial version was kind of clunky. You couldn't play it that well, and so it wasn't that well received. But then they put updates, and it's very big now. So here's the premise with it. It is an MMORPG, massive multiplayer online role-playing game.
Yeah.
So everybody playing No Man's Sky is basically in the same universe. Now, here's what makes No Man's Sky unique. The game designers did not actually create the universe themselves from scratch. They basically gave a supercomputer all the guidelines for the universe. So No Man's Sky has its own periodic table, which is very similar to ours. They programmed in all the basic laws of physics like we know them. And the supercomputer itself created this universe. Now, here's what's wild about it. In No Man's Sky, when it was first created, there were upwards of 4 quadrillion planets to explore. So hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, trillions. That would be like a 4 followed by 15 zeros. You could literally have every computer programmer on Earth making planets their entire lives, and they could never make 4 quadrillion planets.
Okay.
The supercomputer made them all. And they say it's so big, you could literally play this game your entire life and never run into somebody else playing the game. And it's so detailed. I read an interview with one of the game programmers, and it's a simple story, but I thought it was phenomenal. He said he landed on this planet that none of them designed. The computer designed it. And he basically saw bird life flying overhead. And he was on the coastline of this planet. So he said he took his gun in the game, shot one of the birds, saw it fall, land in the water, and then an ocean creature broke up through the water, ate the bird, and went back down in. And they did not design any of this. The supercomputer did. So the crazy part, and it almost gets kind of creepily spiritual because you really start to question our existence, is with our technology today in 2020, if we can already make a supercomputer that does that, who's to say if another civilization who is millions of years ahead of us couldn't then design this reality? Mm-hmm. So the theory there is the Big Bang wasn't the Big Bang as we know it. It was basically the program firing up to start this whole simulation.
So we're nothing but a video game.
Well,
Someone else.
It all depends on how you
video
look
game.
at it, though, because like my experience of myself is still, inexpressibly my own. And it's although the interesting thing is that the more commonality you find with people, the more you realize like how not unique you are on some level, you know what I mean? And so it does make you wonder when you talk about like collective consciousness and like just the fact that like, you know, we all kind of have access to the same information. And as we become more advanced, like Elon Musk's theory is eventually we're not even going to need to communicate, which like that to me is heartbreaking because like I love language. So like I hate the idea. I don't care, you know, if someone knows all my innermost private thoughts, it's like, okay, it's a little embarrassing, but whatever, you know what I mean? I can get over that. I like the mystery of getting to know somebody, you know what I mean? Like I like that exchange that happens. And I think that's the one thing that freaks me out about like alien. The idea of an alien is that like the hive mind mentality, that there's like basically like this civilization that is all connected to the exact same thought process, and like whether it's malevolent or good or, you know, there's like so many different directions you could take that.
Have you all heard of the Akashic Record?
No.
Oh, so
just keep going.
right. Well, you basically addressed it, Julia.
Fred may never recover.
So
soaking it in.
The Akashic Record shows up a lot, especially in abduction lore, and it is basically the idea that there is essentially a central core or database of the universe. You had mentioned everybody being connected, and basically everything is stored there. Everybody can tap into that, and some people think that's why special people here have made so many different advancements. And, you know, initially you hear it and you think, well, I don't know, it's kind of a stretch. But I mean, look at our World Wide Web now. I mean, that's essentially Earth's version of the Akashic Record. So who's to say that couldn't happen on a much, much larger scale?
Right. Right. And that's, I mean, honestly, coming back to like, you know, the topic at hand, we're talking about Bob Lazar and like all what he always kind of refers back to is like if you would take technology like we have today and just drop it in the Victorian era. Right. And like as we discuss these things and they sound so far out, the things that we have access to that we take for granted, like the World Wide Web, you know what I mean? Like rewind 50 years even, and as it exists now, to try to explain to someone 50 years ago that it would exist in that way would have been crazy.
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean? And like, and so that's why I think it's important to discuss this kind of stuff, because like everything that we ever thought was insane, we've been able to manifest on something. Not everything, but a lot of it.
Well, you're exactly right, Julie. I mean, if you look at science fiction, even the most optimistic science fiction, most of it is never wrong. It's just a matter of actually being able to prove that in the future. I mean, Star Trek was great for that.
Yeah.
And there were even remote viewers out there that basically, this is a pretty wild story. You guys,
What's a remote viewer?
I
generally know what it is.
Okay.
Let's clarify that before we go any further.
So remote viewing is the concept, almost like back to the Akashic Record, where you can basically train your mind to remotely view not only any place in the universe, but any time as well. And probably for those of you first hearing about it, it sounds crazy, but there's actually a lot of precedence for this.
Okay.
And that the government has used them.
Both the United States...
Wait.
And Russia. Yep.
Yes, see, he knows about
Fred
it.
knows.
I knew a guy.
Did you really?
Of course you did.
Well, I actually did, and when he told us the story, I went to college. This was in college. I met this guy, and he was telling us about all these things that and we're like, yeah, right, because he's telling us that he did these experiments, and it was U.S. and Russian together back, you know, and it wasn't only till like years later that when they admitted it, everything that this guy said was on this TV show about it, and it's just like. It's pretty, and he was from local PA that went off. He was a what was he? He was a psychiatrist or something like that. And he had said, he goes, yeah, I'm getting old, and here's my story. We're like, yeah, right, you know. But yeah, and he had said that he had gotten Russian scientists and American scientists got together, and they did remote viewing, and everything that he told us about years ahead came out in a TV show, like on, you know, History Channel or whatever, and it's just like, awesome. He was right, you know. But it was pretty cool.
That's really cool. So basically, as Fred said, both the U.S. and Soviet Union had their own teams, and they found that once a person was well trained, their hit rate was about 60%, which is way higher than random chance. And how it actually worked was pretty fascinating. If anybody who's watching or listening wants some good recommendations, there's been great books on it. One of the best is called Cosmic Voyage by Dr. Courtney Brown, and we also have Psi Spies by Jim Mars. And they both basically talk about a man named Ingo Swann, who is a psychic, and he's basically put in charge of developing this for the United States. And how it worked was really phenomenal. The viewers would essentially be given a set of coordinates, and it wasn't even necessarily latitude, longitude. It was just a random assortment of numbers. But they trained their subconscious to basically go to that time and location. And during the sessions, they could not allow themselves to objectively process what they were seeing. If they tried to do that, then the conscious mind came back in and the connection was severed. So they basically would be in this controlled condition, and they would relay this information to what was called a monitor, which is basically a person that sat right beside them and recorded all the data. And then after they recorded what they needed to see, then the connection would be broken. They would actually analyze it. And I'm sure Fred's probably right about the U.S. and Soviet Union working together, but it's interesting because there was also, according to the people that were in it, some battles essentially in the ether between both groups, because sometimes the U.S., and quick background on this, because it was so taboo, different intelligence agencies passed the group back and forth. Nobody wanted to keep it. I think it finally fell in the U.S. Army. But some of the U.S. remote viewers actually recalled seeing the Soviet remote viewers during their sessions, and they just appeared as small, bright orbs, which I found interesting, because think how often that comes up in UFO sightings.
Right.
And they even said, Fred, I don't know if you heard this, they even believed the Soviets had developed countermeasures against the remote viewers, because if they actually tried a couple years in to remote view some of the sensitive Russian facilities, they reported actually seeing a black box in the room that would actually somehow prevent them from seeing anything else in the room. But I mean, with the remote viewers, they would view different dates and times, different parts of the universe. They reported what our outer solar system looked like before the Voyagers got there. And to bring me back to what started this on the Star Trek front, this was kind of neat. One remote viewing session was basically blind. So the viewers weren't told what they were going to be looking at, because that can trigger the conscious mind to start processing. And they recalled being in a room. It looked like an executive room, a conference room, and they got the impression that it was somewhere in California. And they saw a bunch of men sitting at the table hashing out ideas for a future science fiction TV show. But then they also noticed benevolent beings that were in the room with them that the men could not actually see, that were basically seeding these ideas. And so they detailed this session, and then when they broke the connection and came out of it, their monitors basically told them that they were looking at Hollywood, at the original creators of Star Trek. Wow. And so the premise is, part of the reason that Star Trek was always so right about the future is they were basically guided to put those things in the show by a more advanced civilization.
Same thing happens on The Simpsons.
Well, honestly, that's been like a common theme for, like, you know, for Hollywood, and not just Hollywood, but like movies in general. I mean, even look at like Avatar, like you're talking about, like the collective consciousness, like with, like just the idea that they all could access, I forget all the terminology now, because there was like whole worlds built around that movie.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's, you know, you look at people today and they're skeptical about UFOs. Part of the problem is a lot of people will just look at the technology that they see today, rather than assuming, well, this is what we see, but we've got to be at least a good 30, 40 years ahead of what I'm seeing out in the public. And once you embrace that mindset, I think ideas like UFOs become a lot more plausible.
Well, and then just, what was the article in the New York Times? Like, they've, you know, just acknowledged, like, yeah, we have a whole division of government that's studying UFOs right now, but they're calling it something different.
Can you give us an update on that, Jan? Because that's an excellent
like,
point to what you know anyways.
Yeah,
where we are in terms of the disclosure as we sit.
So a lot of that goes back to Tom DeLonge's group that he started. So from Blink-182.
Yes!
I really respect the guy. You know, he could have just stayed in Blink-182 the rest of his life, lived very comfortably, but he was so passionate about it that he leaves the band, I think he gets replaced by Matt Skiba was his name. A lot of people think Blink-182 is not as good now. And he basically starts the To the Stars Academy. And a lot of people have high hopes on DeLonge because they feel like this is one of the few people that's been selected to basically help bring about disclosure, because he is given a lot of insider information from people that were in the government. And so his group was actually the first to break the Tic Tac videos, the 3 videos from 2004 and then 2014-15 from Navy fighter pilots seeing UFOs. And then I guess the most recent update happened a couple weeks ago. The Pentagon admitted that they were in the possession. They didn't call them aliens, Julia, as you said. They just called it non-terrestrial technology.
See, that's still, it's amazing how mainstream media has not grabbed that. And I mean, that's the
think about
biggest
the
announcement in
timing
history.
right now. Like
2020.
I'm about to say that, like, well, and there's been a lot of speculation that, like, drop it here where, you've already got a pandemic, race
That's the
riots,
biggest
all these
announcement.
other things happening.
History.
It's just going to
That's why
fall,
they
like,
did it.
right in the middle of all this chaos.
It's getting glossed over because you're worried about other things. In those Tic Tac videos, if you watch the whole video,
fighter pilot Faber. That's he was just on Rogan. He's like just the most recent pilot, I guess, to deal. But he came forward. If you haven't seen that, you need to see that.
If you watch the whole video of that, he talks about, it's just the one that they show, but he talks about there being more off to the side. It's going to go rendezvous, but they're chasing one, but off in the distance, not on the camera thing, they can see other ships that are out there.
Right.
Yeah, and the idea being that, like, I think the way they've been able to normalize it in such a way that they can put it on the New York Times is that there's, it could just be technology that we as Americans don't have access to. And so we're investigating it because we want to make sure that it's not a foreign
That's the
technology.
disclaimer.
That's the disclaimer.
However, I mean, I feel like we have pretty good access to information currently, talking about the World Wide Web. Like, if there was, aviation that was able to just basically go, like, in these crazy patterns that are totally not capable. I don't know. I can't get my head around it just being someone else on Earth that did it.
So my question is, okay, you can look at the timing of it now, so flying, but why bring it up at all? What's happening in society where the governments or the powers that be feel that they need to release this information, or now's the time to do it?
That's a great question, and that's been debated for decades. I think, to Julia's earlier point, part of it is there are so many distractions now that they can leak a little bit. And
but why leak anything, though? Is there?
That's
it's
a
already
great
been
question.
leaked, though.
It's
Like,
already
that's the
been
problem
leaked.
is that so many of, like, those Navy pilots or whatever,
It can't be contained
It
anymore.
what they weren't people, like, up until this point. Most of the people you could kind of, like, gloss over and say, oh, well, they're just out there weird conspiracy theorists or scientists that are on the fringe or whatever.
Yeah.
These are, like, super.
This Commander Faber's impressive.
That's what I'm saying, like,
to
yeah.
discredit this man is, I mean, you got to go a long way to discredit him.
Right.
And it's also about controlling the narrative.
Yes.
So if they don't respond, there's a chance the story can get out and it just goes its own direction. So by doing this little by little, they essentially stay on top of the story. And you're also going to see this with scientists. I always tell my students that part of the reason I personally think there's always backlash in the scientific community and the religious community and the medical community is, I think deep down inside, people are secretly fearful that what if these things are real? Because what it would do is it would actually jeopardize their own position in society. Like, look what makes a scientist a scientist. He or she has a lot of schooling, very well versed. They're an authority on a matter. But if these other civilizations are out there, especially if they end up being benevolent and want to engage with us, suddenly all these people's positions in society could be jeopardized.
Well, I always believe this to be true, and just my theory, but I don't believe governments as a whole would release this information for the fear of the monopoly effect of immediately the public discrediting religion, and then where do our moral fabric of society come from? It comes from a Judeo-Christian value system that protects life and all these things. They're worried about the moral decay, which originated in these religious constructs, would also go away. if there's
Well-
really no God anymore, if there's no idea of God, or there's no idea of a benevolent, I can't pronounce it, benevolent, oh my gosh, benevolent being, right? I mean, that's, I can see that from a, I don't know, from a governmental standpoint.
Sure.
I think one of the reassuring things, because your point has been debated by a lot of people over the decades, but if you actually look into a lot of contact literature, people that have had these things happen, almost all of them end up being highly spiritual. And it's actually in the other direction. Not that God doesn't exist, but the universe is so beautiful and so teeming with life, and we are just seeing the tiniest amount. So I think it might change our notion of what God is. Even mentioning the Akashic Record earlier, some people think that once we have a better understanding of God, it's not going to be a man up in the clouds with like a big flowing beard. It might not even be a physical entity, but it's that overall connectedness
Right, and
between
that's, I think,
everybody.
where you like how the relationship becomes more personal and like universal.
Yes.
But I think to your point, what you're talking about as far as like timing and like all the stuff with, did you ever hear what is it? And I only heard this from our friend Blank. It's like Project Blue something.
Blue Book?
Yes. So, so like the idea is that basically that they would release all this information,
Project
control,
Blue Book, right?
Project Blue Book.
control the narrative, and basically, whether they're benevolent or not, present an alien race as a common enemy and present it so that we would all have a one world religion, and that basically they would utilize, and then it's like all something about projection screens that they're like going to show us the aliens on these like huge screens, and so enforce the belief on everybody, and then it basically does make you believe that, I don't know, you probably know more about this than I do.
Well, that is one of the theories.
It's a fear. It's not like, and I honestly, I don't know. I'm not saying that's
Now
even
I'm
one
scared.
that I'm
right.
well, that it would be basically like that's a conspiracy, that it's like, you know, essentially that they're all going, like that this is like an intentional leak of information so that we do believe in aliens, and that we do all then like kind of like unite together, and that we don't have autonomy anymore. We won't have different countries, and that
Okay.
it'll be the way they can enforce a one world government too.
Okay.
Nice.
Right.
That's been
It's been debated.
I can see the wheels ticking over there,
right?
buddy.
That's been a long-standing idea that eventually the powers that be are going to fake an alien invasion. I guess the only thing I got, Eric, I can't remember if we talked about this last time. You had mentioned, Julia, that they're going to do this on screens. My personal belief is the screen they're going to use is the sky itself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And this takes me just a quick foray into the WikiLeaks documents that came out.
Right.
And not to get too political, because I know you don't like to do that on your show, but some of the ones that came out,
Wide open today, buddy.
some of the ones that came out was actually during the last presidential election was Hillary Clinton emailing back and forth to her different advisors. And I had read some of the more far out ones, and nobody ever talked about in the media, but they were talking about some wild stuff. They had talked about the idea of essentially faking a terror event to try to get people shifted her direction. And the idea they had was actually detonating a nuclear weapon in an underground mine. And so you can read the exchange back and forth, and basically her advisor said, we can't know if this would actually work. We don't know what the effects would be. Now, what happened then was pretty wild. They mentioned the idea of projecting an image on the silicate layer in the upper atmosphere. And I'm reading this email, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. There shouldn't be a silicate layer in the upper atmosphere. And so that sort of takes me into the whole chemtrails idea, because there's lots of different theories about it. But one sort of side theory I have, if they're actually real, if they are spraying silica particles up there, essentially the same thing that television screens are made from, in theory, if you could keep them suspended up there, at some point, you could basically turn the sky into a giant projection screen. So I just wanted to take that quick aside
Well, and
because
then
you had mentioned
go
that.
back to media and Hollywood and all that stuff, and think about the Hunger Games, and whenever they were like in the dome, and how did they communicate with everyone? It was all on this. Yeah.
Right?
Life imitates art. Art imitates life.
I just remember Jim. What was the movie with Jim Carrey where his whole life was
Truman Show.
Truman.
Phenomenal.
He's out there rowing and he runs into a wall. I mean,
I would put that right up there with The Matrix in terms of movies
sure.
that someday we'll realize, like, wow.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
one was. I think it really had a more human element because
Yeah.
you were only seeing it from this one guy, and like you really
Right.
just had so much empathy for him by the end of the movie. But I agree with you. I think
phenomenal.
that movie made a huge impact on me when I saw it. Yeah.
Again, they're leaking the truth through media. Hey, they've been leaking the truth for years, man, with the Enquirer and the Sun and all those supermarket tabloids. What do you think about that?
That was in Men in Black, right? That was that scene in Men in Black. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So what if the tabloids were true?
Yeah.
Oh man.
They're. When I was walking last night, thinking and preparing for this show, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, I didn't write it down. I'm glad I remembered it. There's a documentary I saw years ago on disinformation. You touched on it a little while ago, but there's also a theory out there, correct, that there's a planned strategy to send out or to attach a UFO story to citizens, feed that citizen a lot of stuff to create this lore to keep people distracted from other things, maybe in the reality.
Yes.
Am I onto something?
You absolutely are. So for those of you watching or listening that have never heard the term disinformation, it is basically the idea, especially today with the prevalence of the internet. Once a story gets out there, I mean, you see a lot of social media giants today trying to pull things down, but once it's out there and people have it saved and can repost it, it's out there. It's there to stay.
Right.
And so the premise of disinformation, which I personally believe intelligence agencies use a lot today, is we can't ever pull the story. We can't make it totally go away. So what we can do is we can flood a whole lot of false information out there too, stuff that is clearly false. And then what so many humans do, it's almost a black or white dichotomy. They'll see something that is clearly hoaxed, and so then they just assume, well, the whole thing must be hoax. And you have that a lot in the UFO community, even as well respected as Stanton Friedman was, and even as impressive as he was a researcher to me, there were still detractors out there that said, no, this guy's actually on the government payroll. He's there to disinform things. Or one of my favorites, this came out around 2004, 2005. Are you all familiar with the legend of Apollo 20?
Vaguely.
So it was basically a series of interviews with an Italian journalist who's very good. His name Luca Scantamburlo, and he supposedly interviewed a man named William Rutledge, who was a test pilot for Bell Labs. He's a much older man now, and he basically claimed that he was on a secret joint U.S.-Soviet mission to the moon after Apollo 17. And there was some footage put out. Some of it was very good. And then there was a flood of really poor footage also put out there that was clearly hoaxed. And so some people believe the actual the actual interviews with Rutledge were actually genuine because they're incredibly detailed, and some of the footage was genuine. But to try to discredit it, then they put out a bunch of really clearly bogus footage as well. So people see the bad footage, they're like, "Oh, the whole thing's a hoax."
Right.
Okay, so let me float an idea to all of you and see if just wrap your head around this for a second. Could it be that Star Wars that Reagan was talking about, I think by 83, 84, 85, I think, and then, toward the end of the late 80s, could that technology have been so innovative at that time, or could there be a lot of truth to that technology, but the government was so, worried about that technology getting out, that the Bob Lazar circumstance was created by the U.S. government, gave Bob Lazar an insight into something, and because think about what happened after Lazar came public. This whole little cottage industry happened in regards to UFOs and Area 51 and all these keywords that are attached to that story as one big misinformation packet to keep the real issue of that advanced technology and weaponry and other uses.
Do you think that was like a way to control the narrative?
I think it was. I think maybe, or control the narrative, or yes, create a distraction of some, and then monitor that distraction, because they've never dispelled the distraction. Because at any point in time, Bob Lazar could have been nullified by the U.S. government, either his life taken, or they could have come out and said, "There's a man or arrested." And I don't know if I believe this. I want to believe Lazar for a lot of reasons. and I kind of go there. I think it is, but I can't rule out the fact that he wasn't a construct of the government for diversion purposes.
But do you think that he was a construct knowingly? Or because like, when I watch
I
interviews with
don't
him,
know.
like I just think he looks very sincere.
Yeah.
And
So
it's-
he
and if-
might
and
not
if-
know.
That's what I'm saying is that if your theory or proposed potential theory is a possibility, that potentially they could have done all that without his knowledge, and that everything he's been saying up to this point, he fully believes and fully happened in his experience.
It's like the Truman Show. It's the Bob Lazar
That-
show.
it's
It's
true
true.
to
him.
They've
It's
done
true to
this
him.
for him.
Exactly. That's what I'm. But in that he did witness all, and that they like let him see just enough.
Yep.
You
So
know,
I did read Dreamland between our
that was
last-
the one that I kept trying to remember
That's
the
okay.
title, and I knew I
I
wasn't
read
gonna
it
get
and
to
then
it
I
anyway.
listened to it. Just I really wanted to immerse myself in it. A little disappointing. Nothing that I haven't not already heard him say. Kind of, maybe a little bit more of the minutia of his life. The one thing that wasn't addressed there, and if it was, I really missed it. He still didn't address the educational circumstance.
Oh, yes. And talk about discrediting him. I think it's fairly likely that his education credentials, as he said them, were actually sincere. I believe he said he initially went to MIT and then on to Caltech. And
There's a junior college in Dreamland. There's a junior college he mentions.
yes, and I think the junior college is the only one that officially still has record of him.
Okay.
And the reason I think he is probably legit is the government even tried to eliminate his own credentials that he had worked at S4, which was part of Area 51. But then to Lazar's credit, he still had his badge, he still had his pay stubs, and so that part sort of died off. So it's interesting. To your point, you're basically saying, could they have fed this information for him to put it out and then basically gone back and also tried to discredit him? Is that what you're
Could they
saying?
have shown him something to see what he would do with it? Like, could they have shown him this particular substance? Or he worked on a reactor there,
Right.
right? Here on the energy source of the propulsion unit, right?
Yes.
And could they have exposed him to something, whether it was factual or not? They got him believing it was, and then seeing what this person would do with it, and he ends up telling people, he ends up coming forth, and the cottage industry grows from there. It sends it. No one could have predicted how that cottage industry would have grown exactly, but it grew and created this whole. I mean, we got a highway named the Area 51 Highway, for goodness' sake. So I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that it's a theory.
Oh, well, it's definitely right, because even Lazar himself admitted that. I'm sure that some of you have heard of the one story where he says that he's being walked down a hallway, and he says he has armed soldiers behind him on both sides, and they basically tell him, keep your eyes straight forward down this hallway. Well, obviously being told that, you're going to try to look out your periphery as much as you can.
Right.
And one of his most fantastic claims, which he's been very objected about, he said as he was being guided forward, he looked to a room to his left, and he could see what looked like two scientists in lab coats with a smaller gray being between them.
And then he later said it was like a doll, right?
Well, Lazar himself said
Yeah.
they could have easily been doing this just to test me.
Right.
There's a chance it wasn't a real extraterrestrial,
Right.
or
Right.
there's a chance that they had some type of smaller flight
or
dummy.
baiting him
Prototype.
to see
Yes.
if he
Yes.
revealed the
Yeah.
information.
Yes. So,
Yeah.
I mean, even these people that are actually in these projects, they're continually tested.
They're tested.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Okay.
It's just like Willy Wonka, where he's given the everlasting gobstopper, and he returned. It's always been a
Good
test.
parallel.
Yeah.
I like that.
See, I'm
a test.
That's where my head's at today. You know, it's just. But you know, along those lines, that's exactly what it was. They were probably testing him just to see how much they could trust him, what he's going to give up, and they could always discredit it in the end.
The one thing that leads me to believe that Lazar's telling the truth, and this is kind of a weird and caught into the minutia of the story, is those Janus flights. They continue
Yeah.
every single day
Out of Vegas.
multiple times
Yeah,
a day.
right.
So whether he's completely accurate or not, something's going on out there that
absolutely.
we're not being privy to, which is insane to me, based upon how much tax money is lost in black projects and all this insanity. We can talk about that anyway, but the Janus flights continue. There's people out there doing weird things. It has to be.
I think what I would add to that, what makes Lazar most credible to me is look at the number of things that he said back in the late 80s that people completely dismissed at the time that ended up being exactly
that
right.
hand scanner thing that he was kept trying to
Yeah.
explain how he was able to get into the, and then they were finally able to find, and I just remember that from the documentary.
Element
Sure.
151.
It was element 115.
Yeah.
15.
115, yeah.
Which I think we talked about this last show. He called it unpentium, and at the time, the periodic table only went up to around uranium.
Right.
But they've since synthesized that one in the lab. He mentioned that the ships operated on gravitational waves,
And now
which
look at the
Einstein
news.
said way back, but they just proved those with the LIGO detector.
Right.
So there's been a number of, even just saying that S4 exists. Because for those people not familiar, you have Area 51 built on the Nellis Air Force Test Range, and Lazar said he didn't work at Area 51 proper. There was a place south of that where there were bunkers carved into the hill, and he called that S4. At the time, people were like, that doesn't exist. They didn't even know that Area 51 exists. And he ended up being right on both accounts. So, so far, the man has been right on every single thing that he has put out there.
Well, and look how long it's taken him to, like, there's this whole resurgence now, and I think obviously, like, Rogan really, like, jolted it. And I mean, they were going to do that documentary anyway.
I think the New York Times, the leak of the New York Times article that has being crafted precipitated Rogan to get him on. I think that's where it started, was that it was coming. And Lazar must have known something was coming.
But think about how long it's taken, because all those original documentaries that are from interviews that he did with that guy, what was his name? Like,
George Knapp.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So those were all from like '89, and it's turned 20. This is
And
like
he hasn't profited
over
from
30
this.
years that he's been
That's
like.
the one thing. He has not profited from this. He's
No,
the entrepreneurial.
he still has a regular job, right?
No, he's small science supply company.
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah.
By mail order primarily.
And
Well,
then
yeah,
What,
and-
what about the FBI raid too? Like.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Well, if you actually look, he's gotten into trouble with the law twice.
The brothel.
Once was the brothel thing, which technically was not illegal in Nevada. But secondly was with this company because they had found, it wasn't even through him, they had busted another company for illegally bringing in materials, and they looked back through their records and they found that he was shipping across state lines. So he's done some stuff, but it's been ticky-tack stuff overall.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think with him, he might realize now your best defense is a good offense. And you see this a lot with UFO writers. I know we talked about this last time, where their biggest danger is basically on the way up, where they're putting good revelations out there, but people don't really know them yet. They could get taken out. People knew Lazar, and I think he really tried to step out of the limelight for the past 20 years. But with the documentary coming out, I think he probably feels pressure, and he knows now, well, if I continue to get myself out there, then if something does happen to me, then it's going to be an even bigger thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeremy Corbell was the filmmaker, the documentarian.
I honestly think like they could have done a little bit better job with the documentary, and I think that him on Rogan was way better.
No question.
And I've heard everyone.
Well, I don't
like,
think Corbell's the greatest documentarian. I think he's good for TV, half an hour TV
trust
shows.
me,
but
it was fun to watch.
as a full length,
It was.
yeah, it just didn't have. It was weird. It was clunky.
It was intentionally
It was kinda clunky to me.
sensationalized. You know what I mean? Like, and for
You don't
someone,
need to for
but
the
that's
story.
the thing. For someone like me, I enjoy that. Like, I want the extra layer of kind of like the cool, like, astral vibe to it. Like, I'm all about that. So for me, it's appealing. But if you're trying to like reach an audience that maybe is a little bit more logical or just kind of like interested in the science, I think they kind of missed the mark on that. Whereas like him on Rogan, and you just get Bob
It was
talking.
raw.
Yeah.
Right. Well, you have to consider too, even if they make the documentary, they still have to have somebody like Netflix that's going to pick it up. So there
Absolutely.
may have actually been pressure like, hey,
Censored.
you can't make this too good
Yeah.
or
Right.
we're not going to put it out there.
Right. No, that's
You
a
had
good
to have
point.
a gloss. You had to have some gloss to it. It had to be. It had to be that level of entertainment had to
Sure.
be there.
Yeah.
Whereas Rogan's entertainment, but I think, we talked about this before, and I won't get off subject, but I want to talk about that interview. There, that was a great example where science has really, through I think Joe Rogan's podcast, has really broken into mainstream consciousness. Because the shows with the theoretical physicists that he has with Neil deGrasse Tyson,
Yeah.
Sean Carroll, those folks, you look at the view counts on those programs, they're off the flipping chart, man. Or this, Bob Lazar, I think this is now his #1 viewed show. So this stuff really is on the conscience of Americans, period. And maybe that's what the governmental powers that be are starting to really acknowledge, that through the internet slowly, but now it's like almost a train. It's coming at them in this train wreck. People want to know this goofy movement to raid Area 51 last year after that. But still, as goofy as it still was perpetuating Area 51 in the news. It doesn't go away anymore.
And if you think about, like, what we're talking about with, what would you call it? The collective consciousness.
The Akashic Records.
So, you've up until this point, we look at people as kind of, and this, it's funny because it even comes back to like what we were talking about with music. You look at people as being very typical. Like, this person is athletic, and this person is smart, and this person is pretty, and this person is, name any adjective, and never the twain shall meet. It's basically that you can't have like people having access to all of these different aspects of the human consciousness or the human interests or types of intelligence or whatever. And then you get someone like Rogan has multiple audiences based on his career. You know what I mean? So you've got people that are into sports, people that are into entertainment, people that are into comedy. And then now, like, just because of his own interests in science, you've got a huge demographic of people that would otherwise maybe not take an interest, but because they're a fan of him.
There's a huge influence
you know what I mean?
society now.
And then now it's like it's opening people up to realize, like, hey, like, I might have thought that I was this kind of person and I'm only into this kind of thing, like with music. Like, I only like this kind of music, but then it widens your like intellectual palette.
Oh, no question.
And so then, it like you were saying, like, what's the danger of an alien race or whatever is that, these scientists that have spent their whole lives getting credentialed, and then all of a sudden we acknowledge that perhaps there is an entire interdimensional, race of beings that are all smarter than us.
Yeah, the periodic table was out the window, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
right.
the people that are most accomplished, and then, and then you look at like stuff like fame and everything. It's like, well, if there are people that literally have access to the entire collective consciousness, or there are beings that have this, what does it matter how many views you have on YouTube, or how many records you sell, or how many fans you have, or whatever?
The measuring stick changes.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Joe has really succeeded in making a lot of these scientists approachable, because prior to that, so many people think, well, I'm not smart enough, I'm not going to read their books. And he has really done a good job of that.
Yeah.
To your point, Julie, I think the other scramble that you are going to see as this stuff is revealed, scientists that have been dismissing and poo-pooing the UFO phenomenon for 30, 40 years, it's not like they're going to be like, hey, turns out all the ancient aliens guys were right, we're going to turn it over to them. It's going to be, they are going to want to keep their power. So you're going to start with subtle things. If you look in a lot of the interviews now, you'll see the word obviously. Well, obviously there's life out there. Well, 5 years ago, you wouldn't be caught dead saying that.
Right.
So you're going to see the mainstream gradually trying to shift their narrative. So when it does come out, they're going to be like, no, don't listen to those guys on the History Channel. Still listen to us. We're the ones that are going to tell you what's up.
Yep. Got it. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, I hope it isn't too much of a left turn, but there was a movie that was done probably 25 years ago or longer called Contact.
Oh!
And that was a great book. That was a great book, too. That was a great book, though.
Carl Sagan.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I had his
book.
So,
Sagan's a whole nother discussion itself. But in that movie particular, and I've watched that movie with Jodie Foster, and I'm sure it's Hollywood's interpretation of the book.
Yes.
I still don't get it.
Oh,
I don't understand. She goes to the beach and her dad shows up and they eat a ham sandwich and they go home.
Yes.
I don't know what the story is.
Do you want to take this one, Julia?
Do you know what? Like, my memory of the plot line is a little foggy. Like, I remember like the specific scenes, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to give a good continual. So you go for it.
Okay. So I'm so glad you brought that one up, because years ago I actually showed it in class for a couple years, like certain parts of it, and we would have a good talk. So the premise, for those of you that haven't seen it, you need to see this movie. It was based on a book by famed astronomer Carl Sagan of the same name, Contact. And so in the movie, Jodie Foster is not a very well-respected radio astronomer. So she's basically using huge satellite dishes, radio telescopes, to listen to the cosmos.
Like it's SETI.
Yes, exactly like SETI. She was actually modeled, the character was modeled off of Jill Tarter, who's a pretty famous SETI scientist. And so partway through the movie, she's being ridiculed, her funding is dying out, and one night, and they shot all of this at the Very Large Array, which is in New Mexico, it's 27 enormous satellite dishes that are so big they move them on railroad tracks. And funny thing about the movie, people saw it and thought it looked so imaginative. They didn't think it was a real facility, but it is. But there's a great scene where she goes out, she knows her funding's about to die out, she's laying on the hood of her car, she's got her headphones on, and she's just listening, and then all of a sudden, pulse, pulse, pulse. And she starts to hear this patterned radio signal. So she rushes back to the lab, and they zero in on the star Vega. And so Vega is one of the closer stars to us. It's about 25 light years away. But that means the signal that they're hearing is at least 25 years old. And there was, I forget the actor's name, he's very good, but he plays a blind astronomer. And so he can hear the signal, and he knows there's more to it since his hearing is so acute, and he knows there's a visual that's interlaced with it. So it's a great scene where they hook up a computer monitor, and initially they just see the Nazi swastika. And for a second, they think, oh my gosh, are there Nazis in outer space? But then they're able to zoom out, and they see it's actually the swastika on Adolf Hitler's armband. And it's actually his opening address at the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games. So this is before the Nazis tried to take over the Western world. And to try to showcase their power, they basically beamed Hitler's opening address out into space. And so the premise of the movie is extraterrestrials picked it up, relayed it back to us through a relay station that they had at Vega, and basically added information. So the information they add, if you remember, Julia, was basically blueprints on how to build this interdimensional craft to get to their star system.
Okay.
Well, and I know, like, it's interesting because it touches on this idea of, like, you know, the fourth dimension in time and all, you know what I mean? And basically kind of getting away from the idea of, like, where I think a lot of people struggle with, like, alien science fiction stuff is it's like we're looking at it like in our own world in this linear time scale and all this kind of stuff, and meanwhile you sort of have to like suspend a lot of those parameters and just sort of like try and fit yourself into this, you know, multiverse kind of.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And so yeah, I think
the confusing part that you're confused by is the end. So not to give it away for people, but
give it away. I want to hear this.
So they basically
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert.
This spaceship that works essentially by bending space-time. And so first she travels out to Vega, and the extraterrestrials aren't there, but she sees this floating antenna, this relay station that's at Vega. And next she's actually taken to their home planet. Now, you had mentioned her dad. In the movie, it's not actually her dad that's seeing her. It's one of the extraterrestrials, but to try to not alarm her, he taps into her memories and takes on the image of her dad so they can talk. And he basically says, this is the first step. There are going to be many, many more steps to come.
Yeah.
And what's great is how the movie ends. She's basically brought back, and officially the government does not believe her story. They ridicule her. But then at the very end, you have James Woods, who just plays a dastardly national security advisor. And he basically says, even though in our time she was only gone for a handful of seconds, her video camera recorded like 16 hours of static. And they're like, that is very interesting. Then the movie ends. So it's got a neat twist at the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that it just really kind of like succinctly just pulls all those ideas of like the collective consciousness and, you know, like the suspending of time and all that stuff. I just think it's like, I don't know.
That's a recurring thing with most abductions, right? Where the
losing time,
or even we talked a little bit about UFO visitation here. People that see and experience that, they lose track of time, or else there's measurements that don't line up.
Yes, and there's a lot of different competing fields on that. I got to meet at a conference David Jacobs. I forget if we talked about him last time.
Okay.
So he is a Harvard professor who has done Harvard. It must just drive them nuts that he is still there. He's done 20 to 30 years worth of studies of basically hypnotic regression for people that said to have been abducted. And I got to talk to him after his presentation. Very, very nice guy, down to earth. He is very nuts and bolts. So basically, according to his research, if somebody says that they were on a ship for 2 to 3 hours if their family is actually awake and looking for them, they cannot find them for 2 to 3 hours. So for him, there's no time dilation. For a lot of people, there is, though. And my own personal take, everybody has smartphones today. Everybody's got great cameras on them, but we don't have any credible footage caught of an abduction. So my personal belief is there probably is some time manipulation going on if abductions are real. So just like the movie Contact, in our time, the whole thing happens in a split second. But if they are able to actually slow down time for the person experiencing it, it can take a couple hours. One of the best pieces of evidence I've seen for this, and I kick myself for not saving it. I presented at the Pennsylvania MUFON conference. It was in Philadelphia. And my presentation was well received. It had been a long day. Lots of people were like seeing me in the lobby, telling me their UFO stories. It was getting towards the end of the day. I was getting kind of burned out. And this young man, he was probably just a teenager, comes up to me with his mom. They had been there for the conference. And he claims to have had an abduction experience that he caught on camera. And like, I'm burned out by that point, but I want to be nice. I was like, well, that's cool. Go ahead and show it to me. It was totally wild.
Okay.
He basically, what he did, he was having these experiences, and so he put night vision cameras focused on him in his room while he was sleeping. And at one point, he shows me this footage where he's laying there asleep, and you see this like little bright orb come in, and then it goes down to his mouth. Now, I initially do look at things skeptically. I thought, well, that's really cool. But it could have been a dust particle that was just caught in some ambient light. It could have been a bug that was in the room, something like that. The wild part, though, as soon as it hits his mouth, his eyes open up. You see a flash of light in both his bedroom windows. Now, still, I'm kind of skeptical. I'm thinking, well, maybe his house is right by the road. A car could have driven by at time. Here's the really wild part. As this happens, you can see the video timer up in the corner of his screen. It's ticking normally. When that happens, the entire thing jumps back by a good 5 or 6 minutes and then starts ticking forward again. I'm thinking,
That's incredible.
son of a gun, like if this is a hoax, this is a
You
good
did a
hoax.
good job.
And I have no idea what would motivate, a young man like this to just like track me down at the end of the conference and show me this footage if it was just a hoax. And I really wish I had kept it. So that to me was like the first evidence I've seen of like some potential time manipulation with these things.
Well, and look at the way our dreams feel. Like if you think about like, when you have a dream and like you like wake up and say it's like, 6 a.m. and your alarm's going to go off at 8 and you're like, oh, I got to pee. I'm going to get up real quick. And then you go back to bed and you have these like crazy dreams. And like, it'll be like, you blink and like your alarm goes off and it's maybe been like an hour the most. And you're just like, I feel like I've been going through this shit for hours.
Absolutely.
That's exactly right. But they say dreams last these long, protracted, detailed dreams only last
Minutes.
Yeah, it's quick, right?
Yeah, and that's, I think, the closest way that we can, like, conceptualize it, maybe. I'm not saying that it's the same thing. I'm just saying that, like, that's how I
agree.
Yeah.
One aspect of physics I really like now, some people are starting to ask, are we sure that time is actually real?
Yeah.
Because one idea is time is essentially a human construct designed to help us make sense of the world. So like if you want to measure an object's velocity, it's the distance it travels by the time it takes to get there. But really the time part is just essentially arbitrary for us to basically have some reference point.
measuring tool.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, to what you had said about dreams, Julia, the same thing happens with people who have near-death experiences. They basically claim not only do they have that life review where the entire life flashes in front of their eyes, but a very high number of people that have these experiences basically say, it was like time didn't exist. I could see everything happening in the universe all at once. And they really have trouble describing the actual experience they're going through in terms that we can understand. But that's a common theme you see. Like, I saw everything happening all at once. So, I don't know. That could be one of our biggest revelations is time either doesn't exist or time as we know it so far is totally off from what it is.
Right.
Well, if time is a man-made construct and it's nothing but a measuring tool, and we've used we've used the I would think just the rotation of the Earth as the measure. That's how we calculate 24 hours in a day, which isn't really exactly 24 hours. But we do that. We accept it, and that's why. Go ahead.
Time. This is my theory on time. I don't know if anybody else. Time's relative to how big you are. Like right now, as we're talking, our skin cells are dying at an incredible rate. All right. But to them, it's an entire lifetime because they're small. And if you get bigger, you get bigger, you get bigger. So our time is relative to what we have. But if you're out in the universe, it's much bigger, so time's slower. And as you get bigger, it's one of these little things that it's like an onion, I guess, if you want to call it like that. And each layer has its own relative set of time. You can go in and you can manipulate that. I mean, and so maybe these abduction things, if you go, be silly, to the next layer over, if they take you somewhere and you go up, you're only gone for, X amount of time, but it ends up being.
Is that the same kind of concept as distance when they, when you take the universe and you fold it like a pancake, these two, now, 2 points, and if you fold it, those 2 points are almost together now.
Oh, you're both talking about slightly different aspects of Einstein's relativity.
Okay.
So first, to Fred's point, that is basically what Einstein figured out in special relativity. He was basically able to prove that time is not absolute. It's not constant. So the faster you go, the slower time goes. And I'm totally on board with exactly what you're saying, because it really does seem totally relative. Like the life of an ant to an ant is going to seem just as long as the life to us. And, there are places in the universe where if they're going faster than we are relative to our orbit around the sun, if there's living beings there, time would go slower for them.
Right.
They would live longer and
Right.
vice versa. But the crazy thing is, without that reference point to compare it to, they wouldn't necessarily know that they're living longer than us. It's all relative.
Right.
Now, what you addressed, Eric, it would basically be, and this is how I think UFOs work, that's Einstein's general relativity, which he comes up with 5 years later. That's where you have large masses, as we mentioned earlier, curving the fabric of space-time, and that allows for possibilities like wormholes and faster-than-light travel. So if you could make a ship that could basically bend space-time, like they did in the movie Contact, then you could get to distant places in a very short amount of time.
Well, and isn't that kind of like always the premise for like outer space type movies? Is they're always looking for like that wormhole that's going to accelerate them from like point A to point B so that they can use some kind of time manipulation to get to where they need to get to solve the big conflict. And
oh, absolutely.
Because
the problem with, and you hear a lot of critics say, well, aliens could be out there, but outer space is so big they would never get here. And there's a couple ways to look at that. Through special relativity, the faster you go, the slower time goes. If we could actually build a ship that went 99.9% the speed of light, you could have a crew of humans basically explore all our known Milky Way within a human lifetime, which is awesome. The problem is, while they're on their mission, time is ticking much, much more rapid for us. And so hundreds of generations would be gone before we ever saw them get back. So to what you were saying, Julia, that's why science fiction always goes with the warpage of space-time.
Right.
It's the only way that you could actually get to distant places, get back, and still have the same generation alive to actually do it.
You're saying if we traveled at the speed of light.
Special relativity, if you go near the speed of light, time is going to slow down enough for you, not just your wristwatch, but your heartbeat, your biorhythms, that you would be able to live long enough to see these places. The problem is, back on Earth,
we're
wouldn't
still
be
having the same.
Right.
So
We're
time
in
to
the
come
same-
back. There could
Did you
be
ever see
generations.
Interstellar?
Yeah.
You'd be hanging out with
Matthew
your great
McConaughey. Oh my God! Like that.
I want you ruined it. That was my next place. Let's go there because
I've been thinking about that as
So
well.
again,
Can I
I've
make a
watched a
request?
movie I don't understand. Interstellar. Take me
Okay.
to school because yes, again, I don't understand.
I don't see. Well, with this movie, this hit me on such like an emotional level. I feel like too, because I feel like they really did a good job at like just kind of like showing like the human aspect of what was happening. So basically, like premise is, Matthew McConaughey is he was a scientist, and then like he gives that up, and he's a farmer. Okay, so he has a farm. He's living with his 2 kids. I'm assuming his wife is gone. She's not in the picture. She's dead, or I don't remember the backstory of that. I know she died, but I can't remember like how she died. They didn't really focus on that as much, it seems like.
Real quick about hidden messages. Isn't it crazy in that movie where he goes into the kid's school and the principal just matter-of-factly says, yeah, the moon landings never happened.
Yeah.
And then they never talk about it again. They just kind of keep going.
Well, so it's like a different society, and basically like, we've got some issues with like dust, essentially, that they would have these dust storms, and they,
What
all
year
the-
was it set in? now, today's
I guess
time?
it's sort of present day, but
I think slightly future where the environment has just totally deteriorated. So their last hope is essentially sending this mission
That's
out.
next year, 2021.
Yeah.
Sure, exactly. Well, and so like he's a farmer, but there's like
next
all
month.
these crops are getting destroyed because there's like no rain. Like there's all these crazy dust storms. The soil is like not ideal for growing anymore. All these problems. And so essentially, like his daughter finds this map he's hearing these, she keeps hearing these like Morse code things. I'm going to totally screw up the plot. You'll probably tell the plot better.
No, that was good. That was good. Yeah.
But essentially, like, she thinks that she's hearing a ghost. And so she's, hearing these, like tapping all the time. And she's like sitting in her room and she's trying to like, figure out what's, these different books are coming out. And then she finally realizes it's Morse code, like later at the end of the movie. I don't want to give away the whole plot because this is a more current movie and I feel like people should really watch it.
Spoiler alert.
But it's so then he gets brought in on this mission. It turns out, NASA's been trying to send someone to the moon forever. He, is the ideal candidate. His son's going to be a farmer, and then he finds out he has to leave. And like that, they explain to him, the reason we're talking about this now is getting back to the time thing. And they explain to him basically like the time that this mission is going to take. Essentially, like everyone that is potentially going to be dead by the time you get back. And so he's trying to like lay the news like softly on his daughter, who like she's like very attached to him obviously because she doesn't have a mom, and he tries to like tell her like time's going to be going slower for me, and when I come back we could be the same age, and all of a sudden she realizes like it's going to be decades before he's back, but it won't feel like that to him. And then he gets like stuck in a different dimension. It turns out, I don't want to say.
I know. Spoiler alert.
Right.
Because I want to know what the hell's going on with this movie.
Well, it's fascinating because it basically combines both the special relativity and the general relativity. So the ship, I think, and I'm a little rusty on it myself, but the ship is capable of visiting these multiple worlds in a very short amount of time.
Right.
So there's some time warping. But then what really made this movie special, and Fred, if you want to add anything to this, because I know you were a fan of it, but is basically it's the first one that actually attacks the idea of different flows of time when you're in different parts of the universe.
Right.
And that's where, isn't it, where things really go downhill is where he gets stuck on that tidal wave plant for a little
the
bit?
Yes.
water planet.
Yeah.
And they lose like how many years or something like that, and all of a sudden like the whole mission realizes they're like, oh my god, like like we thought, because they're trying to find a place that has like water, right, or not just water, but the right conditions for growing.
Yeah.
Because they're going to try to like basically take like a certain amount of people there, or bring the technology back, because like basically they can't save all of humanity. Like they like it's either they're able to like bring something back that's going to save Earth, or they like have this like backup plan. There's all these embryos they're carrying around with them, so they're just basically going to replant the human race somewhere else if they can find a place that's like, and they have so many, and then the whole thing's manipulated by this one astronaut who's in love with another guy that's stuck on another planet or another solar system, and they're like, you only wanted to go to this one because you love him, and
Well, there's the entertainment.
well, that's what I'm
absolutely.
saying, like
Right.
there's a ton of emotional intertanglings happening, and I think that's one of the reasons this movie was so striking, is because all the things we're talking about, they're such big concepts, but like what's important to you now in your life, like your relationships, the people you care about, your kids, your pets, you know what I mean, like the things that like really matter to you.
Right.
It's hard to get your head around these like bigger world concepts.
To what Julia said about, an Interstellar totally replanning and restarting civilization, it reminds me of Alternative 3. Have you guys ever heard of Alternative 3?
No.
Oh, it's so good. Oh, my God.
Oh, okay.
So the basic premise was it was a British movie drama that was based off of a book that a man had written, I think a British author, named Alternative 3. And so the idea is, in the future, just like Interstellar, we have environmental degradation. Something else has to be done. So Alternative 1 was attempting to blow holes in our upper atmosphere to release this blatant heat. And in the movie, that basically fails. And in real life, the United States did try that in the 50s. It was called Operation Starfish. They actually did try to do that, and it backfired. So then alternative 2, this gets into deep underground military bases, is massive underground projects to essentially build subterranean cities to relocate large parts of the population underground when the radiation on Earth's surface gets too high. And so this is back probably in the 80s or so, where there were big fears about the ozone layer. So it was very prominent and prevalent for the time. Alternative 3, though, is wild. Basically, if the first 2 fail, they're going to start relocating large parts of the human civilization to Mars and start over. Now, what made this so fascinating is I think it aired on British television, but then somebody intervened and made sure it didn't air again. And the author actually, I believe, was questioned by MI6, British intelligence, extensively, to the point that he was basically harassed. And he had actually planned to write a sequel to Alternative 3, but he basically just stopped. And he said, even though he was trying to write science fiction, he felt like he accidentally got very close to a very, very real program that was going on.
That's insane.
Yeah, so Alternative 3,
That's
check
a movie
it out.
out there to see right now.
Okay.
I think you can still... I think you have to go onto YouTube where people have done rebroadcasts of it. That might be the only way to find it. But check it out, too.
All right.
Alternative 3.
Alternative 3.
Looking that up.
I know. We need like to do like at the end of this, we should all write down our recommendations and we can, just like on a piece of paper, and we'll like put it out there.
In regards to the time travel movies, have any of you seen the movie Primer?
No.
So it was started as an independent film about 8-9 years ago.
Okay.
It was produced and done. I think there was 3 Primer. 3 film school students made the movie, a very low budget, but it doesn't have that feel. It's got a very uniquely well done production. The essence was that these 3 scientists were doing something in a garage, right? It's a movie.
Right.
But the twist was that they were looking to do something else, and then they realized that they were manipulating time. They went to a storage locker, like these A1 storage facilities. They rented it and they built this time machine, and they basically the crux of the it's fascinating, but the crux of the show, if you pay attention, because there's very little soundtrack. It's a very interesting, quirky, independent film.
Yeah.
But it won all kinds of awards. Very successful. The essence was they would go in there and they didn't realize that other versions of themselves were kind of starting to appear. And when you first saw that in the movie, it was so well done, it was horrifying. Like when he made the turn and he looked over it and across and then saw himself come out of this.
Right.
Then you realize, because you didn't know that was going to happen.
Yeah.
You had no, it was just so well done. Primer.
Okay.
I am telling you
Yeah.
now. And for me, of course, I had to watch it 5 times before I really understood what was going on.
Right.
And of course, read a synopsis on it. But it's not. You got to pay attention. It's one of those movies you gotta pay attention.
That reminds me of, has anybody seen The Butterfly Effect with Ashton
Oh, yeah.
Kutcher?
I didn't understand that one.
That was a pretty good
Yeah.
sneaky time travel movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was solid in terms of alternate
Yeah,
reality.
been a while
what was the
since I saw that
premise
one.
of that movie?
I forget, but it ends up tying in pretty well, because a lot of what physicists grapple with time travel isn't essentially going to the future, it's going back to the past. So, if people say, I always tell my students this in class, if people say, well, I don't believe in time travel, they're wrong. Like Einstein proved with special relativity, you can at least go to the future.
Right.
And they've already proven it with particle accelerators. So they'll take little atoms that are radioactive, and they know how quick their half-lives are. Like these things are decaying in a couple seconds. If they accelerate them to almost the speed of light, then they live that much longer, just how Einstein predicted it. The big debate is general relativity. Could you travel back to the past? Because a lot of these time travel movies is basically, if you go back and you see your younger self, does that create a paradox?
If you shoot your grandfather,
Exactly,
right? That's
exactly, yeah.
Well, and I think that kind of ties back into, like I said, like the human aspect is that, we're so almost like we can't help but be like so self-centered on our own ways. Is that, we realize that there's this huge way of like, manipulating time and space and everything. And what do we want to do? We want to go back and be like, oh, don't make that stupid mistake. Don't give up on that girl. Don't, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like all these things that like, because like our heart are a lot of times what guides us.
Right.
And so then like, then you look at like things like the butterfly effect is that, basically that any little thing could have monumental.
Oh, you're saying if you go back in time, because that's what I always believed to be true. That if you went back in time and you stepped on a blade of grass,
Yeah.
that could set up
and a flower didn't grow where it was supposed to.
I can't pronounce it.
Cascade.
No. Cataclysmic.
That's actually the premise. Do you remember the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episode?
Oh, yes! Oh! Do you know what's funny is that, like, we skip those ones all the time because, like, they're like well, no, because, like, they're like the recap episodes. Sometimes we'll just do, like, scenes, you know what I mean? Like, I like the more, like, continual story.
Yeah, there was one called...
But I agree, the Treehouse ones are sometimes really good.
It was called Time and Punishment, where Homer inadvertently makes a time machine. And initially he goes back, he's trying to tiptoe around the Jurassic era, not affect anything. Yeah.
Oh, I
and
see what you're
then
saying.
things get worse and worse, so finally he goes back with a baseball bat, just clubs a bunch of dinosaurs. And he goes back to present-day Springfield, and Marge and the kids are just sitting at the table eating breakfast. He thinks it's all normal. Then all of a sudden they all shoot out like 2-foot-long lizard tongues.
And they're like eating that way.
Yeah, he just shrugs. He's like, close enough, and then it just ends. Yeah, that's a good one.
Oh man.
That mean in theory that really could happen, right? If you go back, if I'm back today and basically killed Hitler,
Right.
Well,
here's what physicists would say to try to get around this paradox.
Okay.
There's basically two different ideas. One is called timescape, or I usually dub it anti-free will, and the other is called many worlds. So let's just talk about the Kennedy assassination, because probably if a lot of us could time travel, we might want to go back and stop that. So
or see what the heck happened.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. So in Timescape, you can go back to any time you want, but only as an observer. So you could go back to Dealey Plaza, November 22nd, 1963. You could watch Oswald in the book depository, wherever he was. You could watch the Umbrella Man, the shooter on the grassy knoll. But as soon as you try to intervene and change it, some cosmic presence prevents it, because you changing that would then affect your own future. So in Timescape, you can only go back as an observer.
Okay.
In many worlds, you can go back and manipulate whatever you want. But as soon as you do it, a separate world line branches off to prevent the
like
contradiction.
parallel universes.
Yes. So in many worlds, you can go back, and then if you save JFK, a separate world line would branch off. You would still have yours, and then you would have a separate one where a time traveler from 2020 went back to stop the assassination.
Right.
My only beef with many worlds is physicists say anytime a decision is made, a separate world line branches off. So then you wonder, well, what constitutes a decision?
Right.
And they say something as teeny tiny as a single electron jumping up a level in a single atom versus not could branch off a new world line. So the problem with it is basically every second you would have an infinite amount of world lines branching off.
That's how it was described to me as well too. That that even looking left or right, had I looked right there, there's a whole in every infinitesimal like movement. It's creating another layer, another parallel universe layer.
Now, what's curious to me is in UFO literature, if you get into the abduction literature, it seems that neither is true. The premise that seems to be the most true is actually exactly what they show in the movies, where there's one timeline and you can go back in time and actually change things that affect the present. Some people say that's why the Mandela Effect is around today.
Yes. Okay.
Or the one theory. We can
That's the Berenstein Bears versus what is it? I said Bears.
Oh,
so
things
it's
that we
actually
think we've
Beren-
seen and grown up with.
Did I say it right or wrong? Berenstein.
Berenstain. Yeah.
No one. I don't ever remember. It was Berenstein. Or that it was Berenstein was like one of them or whatever, and that it's called the Mandela Effect because supposedly like everyone thinks that he died at a different time or
should we go down that rabbit hole real
Yeah.
quick on
Of
Mandela?
course, of course,
All right,
absolutely.
Do you want to take the lead on that one, Julia?
It's just that basically the idea that there is like that the reason people remember things the way that they do, and that like there's like there'll be these entire collections of people remembering something incorrectly supposedly is that there are time travelers making decisions and changing things, and there's little details that kind of get lost sometimes. The one example is Berenstein versus Berenstein. That was a super popular child's book when I was growing up. I don't ever remember anyone saying Berenstain, and I saw something recently and I had to read it again, and I was like it's Berenstein, and I would have said it like the way I see it in my head would have been like the last part of it would have been like Steine, but it's actually Stain, right? Okay,
yeah.
And then the Mandela effect being like, when did he actually die, or
Well,
did he didn't actually
People
die?
think he died in prison, right? But he didn't.
Yes.
Okay.
That was a great recap.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's named after famed South African civil rights pioneer Nelson Mandela. And so he served decades in prison for protesting basically the apartheid, the separation of races in South Africa. But eventually he did get out of prison and he lived a long life. I think he lived into his 90s.
Became
He
the
was-
prime minister.
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
a beloved political figure and then dies of natural causes. Except people swear up and down that didn't happen. A large group of people remember very clearly him dying while he was in prison, and they even remember teeny tiny details of his funeral that was broadcast on television.
I
Even
do.
mundane things
I
like
do.
the color of the curtains. So this was really the first time that a collective group of people misremembered something the same exact way. And so, to what Julia mentioned, there's countless examples of the Mandela effect today. So one theory is human memory just isn't that great. But the other theory is time travelers actually are going back in time. They're changing bigger picture things, and then you see the ripples in these things. So we're really not collectively misremembering them. One example to give you guys, Fred, this can be on you with your music background. How does Queen's "We Are the Champions" actually end? Does it just say "We are the champions" and fades out? Or then at the end, does Freddie Mercury go, "Oh, the world"? How does it end?
Wow, I never. I gotta go. It's like I gotta go through the whole song. Hang on.
Eric, you could just insert one of your sponsors right here.
Wow.
How do you
So
remember it?
only.
Oh, the world.
Freddie Mercury.
I don't remember
Yeah,
him
but
saying
it's-
that at the end.
But it,
See, we got two different
I
bands.
don't remember him
know.
saying that at the end ever.
we are the champions. Now, I'm going to say it's of the world.
I don't
It
remember
turns
him
out
saying
on this example of the Mandela effect, Eric is the one that's right
Yeah.
here. And when I use this in class, because students know Queen. Queen might be the most amazing band ever. Sorry, Beatles. And they swear up and down like, no, it's at the end of the song. And at least in our reality today, I'll play it. He actually says it after verse 2, not at the very end of the song. So that's sort of
Awesome.
the twist of the Mandela effect.
That's killer.
Yeah.
And that also leads us into one other theory about aliens we didn't talk about at the beginning. Some people believe aliens are not from another dimension. They're not from some other planet, but they are actually future human
Us.
beings.
Yeah.
After the environment has deteriorated to the point that we're no longer like these beautiful forms like we are now, we're more rough and we're more rugged to try to sustain this. And that actually comes around to explain the abduction phenomenon. People see aliens and abductees talking about biological samples being taken, and they think it's so prevalent now because we are living in the last time period where Earth is still fairly pristine and unaltered. So their theory is this is future humans coming back to today to try to take some of those biological samples before pollution, radiation, nuclear war ruins our DNA. So
and
future humans.
that comes up on Rogan too, because he talks about like just evolution in general as being like, you know, if you look at us as being evolved from like chimps or apes or whatever, and then, you know, becoming less hairy, less muscular because it's not necessary for our environment. And then what becomes necessary, bigger brains, you know, tougher skin, things that would require us. And also, you know, the idea that aliens don't have genitals and basically that we don't need to reproduce in the same way anymore. They found a way to like do that without the fun way. Which sounds like a terrible future if you ask me. So if there's anyone listening,
It's a long way
if
off.
we
Yes.
could prevent that, that'd be great.
I definitely think it's very feasible, at least logically, that we are the aliens we see or we think or we wonder about could certainly be us in the future. That's the most logical
It's
thing.
terrifying. That's the most terrifying thing if you ask me.
So the Goldilocks zone is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's inhabitable planets that have the same distance from their heat source and have other similarities to Earth in different star systems. Is that correct? Or different solar systems?
That's a great explanation. So it comes from the fairy tale character Goldilocks. So she breaks into the bear's house. Some of the porridge is too hot, some's too cold, some is just
Okay,
right.
that's where the analogy is. Okay.
Yeah, and then I think what you were alluding to is, since our type of star is just one type,
Right.
based on what type of star another civilization's around, the Goldilocks zone could be at a very different distance. And that's one theory on gray aliens. Neat episode of, I think it was UFO Hunters. It only lasted like 3 seasons. We talked about it last
Right,
time.
right.
But they actually showed an evolutionary biologist a drawing of an alleged gray alien with the big black wraparound eyes. And he looked at it very objectively, and he said, it made a lot of sense. He said, if this being were actually real, my guess is they probably would have evolved around a red dwarf star, which they're the most common type of stars out there in the universe. But because they're so small and red, we can't see any of them with the naked eye, but they are all over the place. But because they're so small and dim, not only would a planet have to be a lot closer to it to hit that Goldilocks zone, but over time, evolution would probably favor beings with bigger eyes to see in those low light conditions. So looking at other civilizations, it's kind of neat to take the approach of, how do they look different than us biologically, and how might the environments of their planets have affected their evolution there versus ours here?
But seriously, like, all joking aside, like, what is like the science, or I don't know, maybe it's not scientific or whatever, but what is the explanation for how they would reproduce? Like, is the idea that they are that it's not necessary, or that they are just genetically making people based on DNA in like labs, or what?
There are different takes on this.
Okay,
And
I'm
so
curious.
That's a
I
great
like
question.
that I'm not like being like, you know,
Right.
I'm honestly curious.
So in the remote viewing accounts I have read, who have viewed the gray aliens in the future, it was actually a conscious choice by them.
Okay.
So basically, things had gotten so sexually perverse that they made the conscious decision to basically breed that element out of them so that it no longer hindered their civilization. According to abductee accounts, if you look at like the most terrifying book that I've ever tried to read, was even worse than Communion. It was called The Watchers, and it was a series of accounts.
Fred?
I've heard about it. I haven't read it. I haven't
There's
read-
multiple movies about that, right? I've seen like there's
There might be.
Watchers Volume 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, it was by a woman who was abducted many times named Betty Andreasen, and the hypnotherapist and the writer was named Raymond Fowler. And basically the whole book is word for word her accounts while she's under hypnotic regression. And she was also a very good artist. So the drawings in the book are absolutely terrifying.
Yeah,
so I
she's
made it
drawn.
like,
Oh, we gotta
oh my
see
gosh.
this.
Did you read it?
I have not
Okay,
read it.
okay.
I've heard about it, but I haven't
Yeah.
read it.
Oh, I got 100 pages in. I was like, heck with this book. But to a lot of these abductees, they basically recall seeing small fetuses essentially grown synthetically outside of the womb. And this is also where wise baby dreams come in. So a lot of women around the world will essentially report having an abduction experience or a very, very vivid dream where they're essentially given a baby to hold, and they can tell right away it's part human but part something else. But they can also tell, call it mother's intuition if you would like, that it's definitely their baby. And so the idea there is this civilization is so far ahead that they have basically lost all empathy and emotion. And so even though they're more advanced than us, they're also jealous of the emotional range that we can show. And so they want to have the mother there to try to give some emotional reinforcement to the child, because they're trying to essentially get back to what we are now. They're trying to basically remake their species so that they can again breed naturally, and that they can also use elements of humans that they find very desirable.
So in the future, they have bred the humanity out of the being.
Yes.
And then they are trying to like
Bring it back.
reverse
Bring it
engineer it,
back.
essentially.
And it's, you listen to these, and for those people listening or watching at home, like, you're initially like, oh my gosh, I hope Eric doesn't have this guy on again. It's
Oh, get
ridiculous.
outta here.
But
No
like,
way.
look at what humans are even doing now. Even for women that want to conceive and they go to a sperm bank, you can already see pictures of the donors, descriptions. I mean, we've been basically genetically breeding ever
What
since.
about like CRISPR and everything? Like the idea, like the CRISPR that basically like you can, the idea of designer babies, essentially.
Yeah,
That like
absolutely.
you can create DNA that will, you can basically take out any genes that'll express certain diseases, anything like that, and then also then manipulate them to look the way you want them to look, essentially.
We're entering a period that they dubbed transhumanism, where technology has gotten so great that we are basically going to be a synthesis of man and machine. Like you mentioned Elon Musk earlier, he just this past week started to make a ripple talking about the benefits of implants inside of people.
I just watched that last night.
Well, it's initially supposed to do things that are like more orthopedic.
Initially.
And then control seizures.
Did you watch it? Oh, I watched it last night. I watched his presentation.
I've seen him on Rogan a couple times, but I've also just watched a couple of his interviews.
This is pretty horrifying what I watched last night.
But I knew that it was like the next thing was, what is it called? What's the chip called? Neuralink.
Neuralink.
But basically, it'll be attached to a computer, and so that way, if there's something that's
supposedly it was exterior initially. Yeah. Like there was an incision made, but the devices were exterior, and that was last year.
Yeah.
See,
this presentation where they cut a piece of his skull out, and they put this transmitter, and then took the lead wires and connected that to the brain. And he showed the surgery being done. Like it was part of the presentation, which I wasn't ready to see. Wow. That was part of it.
Wow.
No, well, but it's weird though, because if you, like, whenever people present our initial instinct is like, oh my gosh, like, but if you look at like what is being done in the medical community, we're like, what's a pacemaker?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The pacemaker is basically just to send an electric shock to your heart when it stops working.
It's a very good point.
But I think when you get into the brain, it's like, we look at our consciousness, our experience of the world, and like, I mean, yeah, you could stop somebody's heart with a pacemaker for sure. But beyond that, you can't really control what they do. However, like if you're putting some, I don't know, like that scares me.
The Manchurian Candidate.
Yeah, well, I mean, they can already do that just with like hypnosis.
I think that was actually the plot of one of the seasons of Homeland. They end up
up on that. Yes, I'm like almost at the end of Homeland right now, and I'm like ruining the day that it's going to be over because I've been watching it all summer.
Right, absolutely. I don't think the trust element is there right now between regular citizens and governments for these implants, and like that's not to talk politics, but that's why you're seeing such a pushback for global vaccines. People believe in vaccines. They're very good. They stop things.
Absolutely.
But the potential is there for basically what's called a kill switch, where if something is put in and then the powers that be that are monitoring that aren't totally moral and ethical, if you step out of line, just like how China now has their social credit score, it can just be like pulling the plug in the matrix and then boom, you're just out of the game.
Well, and I read all kinds of different articles, and I read something recently that said that they were working on developing a vaccine that was gender specific. And to me, that's really frightening, because it's like, why would you need a gender-specific vaccine?
Right.
Like, what else could be done with it? What else would be...
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
To me, like, all that's... Like, I am pro-vaccine, just, put that out there. Like, you know what I mean? But, yeah.
Believe
especially,
in the science.
I agree. It's like, our trust in the powers that be, regardless of what side of the line you're falling on, I think now more than ever, we have the least amount of trust that we've ever had in the past. And so it makes things like different advancements that could potentially be helpful really challenging, I think, for the scientific community, because they're, who's guiding them.
Right. And just to get it back to aliens, to not get Eric in trouble, but a common thing that you see supposedly from other civilizations regarding humans is we're essentially a dangerous mix right now, because we've got crazy high technology but crazy low morality, spirituality. And that dangerous mix is basically making benevolent civilizations take somewhat of a hands-off approach.
I would imagine so. And that's a whole nother rabbit hole. Couple things I want to ask you about. One is, can you shed light on the physician who over the past 15 or so years has made his name for himself, or I say it's a him, I think it's a he. He's been removing objects from people's bodies that they say were implanted by.
Little implants.
Yes.
And the other question is, I didn't see...
Wait,
like,
I'm not familiar with this, so...
there you go. We stumped you. I can't believe it. But what you don't see in the documentary, which is really puzzling, is they don't show the analysis of the material. You know what I mean?
Yes, alien implants is one of the more terrifying aspects of the abduction phenomenon. And interestingly, I would say it peaked in the late 90s. So does anybody want to think what show is super popular then all about aliens?
X-Files.
So it goes to show how, the media can basically control what people are interested in.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is basically for long-term abductees, something is essentially inserted into their bodies so that they can either be continually monitored or make it more easy for another civilization to find them again. Now, some of them have definitely been ruled out as being aliens. Sometimes people will have an accident and they'll inadvertently have tiny pieces of shrapnel inside them and not realize it. And then later on, they're like, oh my gosh, what is this? Is this an implant? But some of the scarier ones, a person will have an abduction experience. They'll later go to get a CAT scan, and there will be something artificial so deep down inside their brain that there's no possible way that they could actually get it in there. A consistent and terrifying theme with abductees is the idea that something is inserted up through their nose during the experience, and they recall actually being able to hear the cracking sounds as it's pushed up in and left there. Now, to your question, Eric, some of them have been pulled out, but so far the analysis is frustratingly inconsistent. On one hand, what's curious about them is they never show any signs of inflammation at all. So somebody has a very vivid dream or an abduction experience, they remember it, they wake up the next day and something is inserted under their arm. Unlike a regular foreign object, the skin is never inflamed. It's just comfortably in there. And so the analysis they've done is on the outside, a lot of these things seem to be coated with keratin, like the same thing that would make up our fingernails. And most of them seem to be some conglomerate of different organic materials.
Okay.
And it's led some skeptics to believe, well, it's not really an alien implant then. It's just something that your body has produced on its own. So we seem to be missing the idea of something coming out and it having wires on it or some type of transmitter. But at the same time, look at what microchips look like today
Right.
versus when they were invented in like the late 40s, early
Right.
50s. If
Right.
somebody from back then looked at a microchip today, they would say that doesn't look anything like a computer chip.
Right.
So maybe a civilization is so advanced, they've really synthesized the inorganic and the organic together.
Well, and if we're talking about, going way back to the beginning of the conversation, if they're like literally able to take genetic material and make pilots, why wouldn't they be able to make
Exactly.
a probe that, or like a, implant
Right.
that would mimic our DNA,
Right.
or our skin, or
It's,
whatever.
it's a monitoring thing, right? I mean, that's the theory. Is this?
That's definitely one of the theories.
So
And-
who's this doctor? Like, come back, like.
I can't remember his name.
I can't either.
So someone has basically like done this multiple times, and you're saying that.
Well, I saw on this film where he had a piece of metal. It looked like a piece of metal, and they seemed to. There was a level of consistency where it looked like a little pin. Like if you took a sewing needle, a thick sewing needle, and you chopped it in half, that length about like this, and like a rod. That seemed to have a theme.
And it was in multiple patients, and it always usually has to go back to like people with that believed they were abducted, but they were coming up with these little metal rods,
Yeah.
little tracking devices.
How'd they find them? Like what? Like
MRIs or
Okay,
CAT
all right.
scans
Yeah,
or
yeah.
where
And then some are visible. They'll be right under the skin where you
Right.
can push on your skin and
you
it'll
feel
poke
it.
up.
Yeah, but what are they made out of? Because if it was made out of elements we couldn't identify, that would be an alarmist.
It would be.
Alarm.
What's really fascinating, I'm glad you asked that because I want to mention it. Most of these things that have been recovered, they aren't made out of elements we've never heard of before. They're the elements we have. The big difference is on an atomic level, the atoms are lined up in such a way that we just can't do today.
Yeah,
and
got
what
it.
seems to happen, and Fred, maybe you want to add this if you read about what seems to happen on the subatomic level, when you are lining up atoms perfectly in sheets, they have really weird properties, these elements that we just don't see today, because for us, when they occur naturally, there is atomic structure, but things are more chaotic. So far, this is at a level of engineering that human beings cannot do, even though it's using elements that are common to Earth.
Yeah, they're finding them. It's just it shouldn't be like it shouldn't exist like that.
Yeah.
naturally.
Yeah, I get it.
And that's
Okay.
what. But again,
Intelligent design.
yeah, intelligent. It's like under the skin, and they're small. Like Eric said, they're like little needle things. But
pins.
but and from what I understand, some have been found like on knees
Yeah.
or shit. But it, you know,
So do people have like a sense of where they are? Like whenever
you
they
can,
like
you can feel
that's,
them.
Yeah, so that's what I mean. Like
Yeah,
it's like
you know, and they don't know how it got there.
Okay.
And like you said, like there, you know, there's no irritation to the scene. I watched it. I watch all this stuff.
It's pretty frightening.
it's terrifying.
People will report like an electrical like tingle or shock
Yeah,
when it's pulled
right.
out. Nah.
So, okay, another question. There was a famous story that I don't know if it was a law enforcement officer or I don't know if he was an engineer, but in a mine somewhere years ago,
I know what you're gonna say.
the gentleman died. The gentleman died, but I don't know if it was MUFON.
Phil Schneider.
Phil Schneider. He gave lectures or he gave presentations before he died,
Yes.
and that was so popular for a decade or two ago, and then it kind of just faded away. But
Those were the Dulce Wars.
yeah. So let's dive down that rabbit hole because that always that's pretty terrifying. All right, Phil Schneider.
Sure.
Lay it on me.
So Phil Schneider, you will find him a lot online in reference to what were called the Dulce Wars. And his story is very interesting and compelling. And a lot of people feel like he was essentially murdered for telling his story like he did. So he wasn't in the military. He was not an astronomer. He was actually a geologist. And so he was actually subcontracted by the military to hollow out some areas around what is dubbed in conspiracy circles as the Dulce Base.
Okay.
So this is Dulce, New Mexico. There's a high plateau called Archuleta Mesa. And even the Native Americans who live in that area say that for many, many years, there's been something going on under the ground. And so this is a whole side rabbit hole on what are called DUMBs, deep underground military bases.
Okay.
And so there is some pretty interesting but relatable technology here. So some people believe there's an enormous honeycomb of underground bases and tunnels, literally huge subterranean cities spanning underneath the United
Levels.
States. Yes, many levels. And how they supposedly do it is with a nuclear-powered drill. Because, like, if you've ever seen The Shawshank Redemption, you know if you're tunneling, one of the biggest problems is where do you put all the dirt you're pulling out? So, according to this conspiracy, they don't have to worry about that. The drills basically get so hot, they essentially melt all the rock in front of them, turn it into liquid, and then it seeps into all the pores and hardens into glass. And so you automatically have done away with the issue of where do you put the dirt and rock. You also don't need any structural supports because it basically makes like a glass line tube as it goes. So according to Schneider, he was doing some subcontracting work for the military, and he said that he was very taken aback by the high security. He said in his mind he was basically just doing standard geological rock analysis, but he was always accompanied by Green Berets who were armed.
Okay.
And on one particular time, they were tunneling out an area and they were down many, many levels, and they inadvertently cracked through the wall of an already existing cavern system. And to his shock, they were suddenly not alone. They appeared to be extraterrestrials out in front of them already inhabiting this
Smell
cavern.
really bad or something? I'm trying to remember what.
A sulfurous smell it's interesting, not only associated with ghosts but also extraterrestrials. I don't know if he had reported on the smell of this one, but instinctively, even though he was a geologist, he was armed, he instinctively pulled out his sidearm and started to shoot. Now here's where the story gets really fantastical. He claimed the alien beings started to shoot back. He described them actually having packs on their chest, and he said they could rub the pack and a bright beam of light like a laser would shoot out. So this dramatic battle sequence is going on under the ground where Green Berets are rushing out of the elevator to try to neutralize the extraterrestrials, and the extraterrestrials are shooting back. Now, according to Schneider, he is the only human that survived this. He said one of the Green Berets, he said he doesn't know who it was, but it was the whole reason he was alive, grabbed him by the shirt, threw him back into the elevator, hit the button, and the elevator went back up. So this led to the legend of the Dulce Wars, and there were supposedly up to 65 Green Berets that were killed during this. Now, skeptically, you might think, well, anybody could make up any story. Schneider felt like it was his duty to try to tell as many people as he possibly could about this. So he enters the UFO lecture circuit. And what's interesting, not only did his story remain consistent, but he would actually, if he was asked, he would open up his shirt.
Yeah.
And there was a big, basically, burn mark the whole way down the middle of his chest. And then one of his hands he would hold up, and a couple of his fingers were just melted down. So he claimed he was actually grazed by this beam before he was thrown back into the elevator. And he probably must have been on to something, because he met his fate in a very curious way. He had warned people and warned his friends that he felt like he was about to be killed. And he was estranged from his wife at the time, but they still kept in contact. And when she didn't hear from him for a time, she sent friends to actually see if he was okay in his apartment. And he was dead, and the coroner ruled it a suicide, but it was in a very curious way they found his body. They found him sitting in a chair beside his bed with his feet propped up on the bed, and he was totally naked. And after the coroner ruled it a suicide, his wife went in to see the body and said they actually found a rubber hose that was wrapped tight around his neck, which asphyxiated him, which made her furious, because she thought, how in the world does a coroner miss a detail like that?
Right.
So, I mean, you can actually see pictures of it online, and I'm warning you, it's pretty graphic,
Yeah.
but clearly this is a man that did not commit suicide. He must have been close enough to something that somebody wanted him gone.
How did he describe the aliens? I mean, obviously it happened probably so fast, but
That's a great question. Fred and I were talking about that over the break. Fred, what did you hear with that?
I thought they were reptilian, but you thought they were grays, right?
Yeah, I'm unsure, but reptilian would make more sense, because that ties into the whole idea that these beings originally inhabited Earth. They're now deep underground.
Yeah.
So you could be totally right on that.
Well, even like the old Indians in the Southwest, they talked
Yes.
about the insect people and the reptilian
people,
Yeah,
yep.
the
Yes.
ant people.
Yep.
Yes.
And I started watching Skinwalker Ranch, and that's what they talk about, all that stuff out there,
Yeah.
all the stuff going on under the ground. And
Right.
and it's just so, I mean, the Southwest has got all kinds of great alien and being stories. They talk about the Indians catching them and trapping them, the giants and stuff in the caves, and they burn them out. They killed all these giants and alien beings that
giants. What about the alien, the giant aliens?
Well,
that was
funny thing is that giants and Native Americans relate. You know how in Old West movies, if a cowboy met a Native American, he would go, "How?"
yeah.
Interesting story about that, the history of where that comes about. Native Americans and giants were supposedly mortal enemies. Curiously, the giants supposedly had 6-finger hands instead of 5
show.
fingers. So the how was basically, I have 5 fingers. Do you have 5 fingers too? Are you
I
my
remember
friend
hearing
or my
about that.
enemy?
Yeah.
Talk about
yeah.
the giants. Like, how giant were the giants?
Oh, they were giant.
This isn't an episode of Seinfeld here.
Well, they would because I've started to go down this hole too with all, because I you know what, it's COVID. And I just,
Yeah, what else? We have nothing going on.
everybody's like, you disappeared for the first 3 months of this. You know where I was at? I was in there watching YouTube videos and all this stuff. And one of the things that I really loved was the giants. And they talk about that, they were 10 feet and maybe taller, but they had the double rows of teeth, and they've dug up like skulls around the world. Yeah. And they have, they have double rows. And they're big, and their bones are big. And if you look at all these, history, even in the Bible, talks about giants. You know what I mean?
Into Bigfoot at all? Just curious.
It sounds like a Norwegian black metal concert.
But yeah, so long as, but there was like a long history of Native Americans, and they would talk about this, but giant statues, giant skeletons have been found and they're even in the Smithsonian, from what I understand, and it's locked up.
These are great talking points. Fred's exactly right. The overall premise, and it goes through many religious texts. Old Testament of the Bible, it's in the opening pages of Genesis, but lots of cultures had a story that the giants, according to the religious text, were essentially the bastard offspring of when the sons of men, or the sons from the sky, came in unto the daughters
That's right.
of men.
Yeah.
And this leads to like great flood stories of Noah, like they tried to basically wipe them out.
That's why I try to wipe them out.
And so that's where the giant mythology comes from. I'm on the fence with it. I tend to believe it because I put a lot of faith in older religious texts, and it dovetails so nicely with Greek and Roman mythology.
I was thinking the same thing, and that all the Greek gods and that
Oh,
there
Yeah,
was
really?
Cyclops,
there
right?
was, like,
Cyclops come from these people.
tons of interbreeding between the gods and humans, and that was
Explain
where
to what
like
I-
the whole second strain of like the
Right.
like, you know what I mean? Because there was like the initial gods, and then there was like the hybrid gods, essentially.
Exactly, and those are the ones that most ancient cultures recognized as the gods, but
Right.
those were the hybrid ones. The only thing that gives me some pause with it is I know even today, men who end up being over 7 feet tall don't sadly live full lives usually, because
Right.
it's so hard on their heart to basically pump blood through their whole body. And some of these giants that are described with the skeletons are 15, 20,
Yep.
30 feet tall.
Over 10 foot tall.
But what always happens,
Really?
happens,
Oh, I'm amazed.
they'll have the skeleton, but then something will happen. There will be an earthquake, the skeleton will disappear. There will be a rainstorm where almost the whole skeleton washed away except one piece. But Fred is not incorrect either in that the Smithsonian allegedly had a very, very large collection of these. But anything that is now deemed taboo or inconsistent
see.
with the mainstream narrative tends to disappear. And so the giant claim is a little more controversial, but we know that the Smithsonian did this when they found little tiny gold pendants in a lot of these Mayan and Incan tombs that basically looked exactly like airplanes today. In the original Ancient Aliens, not the series, but it was
Right.
actually History Channel In Search Of.
Right.
There were some engineers that recreated one of those gold pendants to the proportions of a model airplane,
Right.
and they made the thing fly. As soon as that aired, all the pendants from the Smithsonian disappeared. So the giant
weird.
one is a little more
That's
legend.
the thing that Giorgio always wears.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's
exactly
exactly what
one.
it is.
So
Okay.
things disappear from museums if they don't match the narrative.
No, supposedly right there in Columbus or Snake Mound or whatever that is.
Great Serpent Mound.
There was a giant, or they found skeletons as close as there to us. So I mean,
Big skeleton. You're talking about big people.
yeah, these 10, 15-foot people with double rows of teeth, and they existed, and they had them at the Smithsonian.
That's crazy.
From archaeological exhibition. Yeah, I'm getting like you now.
I know. I
Yeah,
can't speak today.
But
Exhibition.
yeah, so there's all kinds of fun things.
So wait, can I just ask? Is the idea that they were potentially like descended from gods, or are they an alien race? Like, what is the narrative? Like, what was the theory?
Well, if you look into the ancient aliens theory, at least, von Däniken would argue that a lot of what the ancients were calling God or the gods were basically these beings of very high technology. So I think the premise is it wasn't the first generation. It was basically the extraterrestrial human offspring that were the giants. Also, what ended up happening, because I'm reading right now, it's William Bramley. He's the big bearded dude that's on Ancient Aliens. He wrote a book called The Gods of Eden, and it's a look at like all the world's religions going forward. But basically, the people that were the mediators between the gods and the regular humans basically became like the high priesthood, the first gods to these people, because they're the ones that relayed what happened. So basically the giants, and then these people that served as the intermediaries, some people believe were like the first gods that we had here.
This is crazy. Okay. So I know we're jumping around here. We're a little short on time. But I want to get to these things before we disconvene. What's that called? What's the right word?
We'll go with that.
Yeah.
I make up my own language. As I go.
Until next
Wait, you
time.
didn't use the word of the day yet, though.
Cattywampus. Everything's been so orderly today that I haven't had a chance to
I've
use
been
it yet.
quiet. That's why.
Some things that puzzle me selfishly. Machu Picchu, am I pronouncing that?
Machu
correctly?
Picchu.
Picchu. So one of the earlier episodes, I don't know if it's Ancient Aliens or whatever documentary I saw, what fascinated me more than all the esoteric stuff, Jim, was that those rocks, is that where the rocks are just cut at such geometric precision? Am I at the right location?
Melted into shape.
That's at Pumapunku, which
Yes,
is nearby
Pumapunku,
there.
Pumapunku.
Right.
Okay.
So no, you're not wrong, because a lot of these Incan sites, so we basically have Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas.
Okay.
And then the predecessor to the Mayan and Aztecs were the Olmecs. So basically, Aztecs, think about central to northern Mexico.
Right.
Think about the Mayans from basically central Mexico through Central America. And then the Incas are basically in northwest South America, like Peru, Bolivia, that area.
Peru.
So you've basically got a lot of things down there that we can't explain today. So at the site you mentioned, basically the precision of these cuts is just phenomenal.
Yeah,
and we don't know how they did it.
That in of itself, if you can't bring a skeptic to look at that with a crooked eye,
Yes.
I don't know what you can do.
And I think the episode of Ancient Aliens you're referring to is they basically, the rock they were working with, the Incas or whoever built was working with, is granite, which is a ridiculously hard volcanic rock. I think on the Mohs hardness scale, I know this from geology class in college, but from a 1 to a 10, a granite's like an 8. So really the only thing that can cut is like ruby or diamond.
Yeah.
And so some of these cuts are so ridiculous that even today, if you ran your finger over it, it would draw blood. And so what they did is they took a lot of the pictures from there, and understand it's not just basically cubes. They were basically enormous Lego blocks of stone, but they weighed 5 or 10 tons. They had teeth that would nest together so perfectly that even to this day, you can't fit a knife blade in there. And so what they did is they at least took pictures to the biggest granite quarry in the United States. I think it was in California. And they showed the foreman, and he just kind of laughed and he shook his head. And he said, even with our best laser-guided diamond-tipped drills and saws, he said, we couldn't do that today. Now, at nearby Saxoyuman, totally different technology. There it looks like the blocks were basically poured in like molten lava and hardened into place. And we have no idea how that was done. The legends from the people that live there claim that there is actually a plant extract, a liquid, and when they would rub it on the stones, it would temporarily change it to the consistency of a putty, and then they could actually shape them and melt them together. But no such extract has ever been found. So long story short, we have ridiculous technology, especially with the Incas, and we have no idea how it's done.
There also, correct me if I'm wrong, there's also a technology or a theory of a technology that some American who has a plant somewhere or has a stone yard or somewhere that he supposedly can move these big stones.
Sonic. It's all sound.
With either sound or with some voodoo going on there. I don't know.
Edward Leedskalin.
Yeah.
I don't know the details.
Was that Coral Gables, Florida?
Yeah, Coral Castle.
Yeah,
go for it, Fred.
So check it out. So this cat, he was like an older guy or whatever, and I don't know why he did it. Was somebody left him, his wife died or something, and he built this monument. But what he was able to take these blocks of coral
and move them,
but nobody ever knew how they did it. There's only one picture, and it's a tripod. All right, so he has like a tripod, and there's a box on top of it, and whatever was in that box gave him the ability to by himself levitate, move,
and then guide
him in the and overnight he was able to like move blocks.
Did he only work at night?
Yeah, that's why I went for under secrecy. Am I correct on that?
You're correct on all fronts.
So check it out.
This is freaky.
But what they think is the vibrations can levitate these.
How come we haven't figured that out by now? I mean, with all this, you would think that's elemental science, right there.
You got
right?
cats like Tesla out there who knew about electricity, making it universal and stuff like that. And it was
he also married a parrot, didn't he?
Repressed by the repressed by the. It was taken away from the government.
He married a bird, by the way.
But the thing is talking about this. We talked about this earlier about touching on one point in the universe. Tesla said he got all his messages, in a transfer, but it came from somewhere else.
Right.
How he could do the the electricity. This guy, the guy with the Coral Castle never told anybody how he did it, and he did it alone.
Did he die?
Well, yeah, he died.
He's
He's not down there building shit now.
How long ago was this?
So just to add to what Fred said, so his name was Edward Leedskalnin. He's a tiny man. He was like 5'2", 100 pounds.
Oh my
and
God.
he leaves Latvia because his fiancée stands him up on the day of their wedding. And so he comes here,
the poor
and they
guy.
were very young. He tried to make this castle as a homage to her. He called her Sweet 16.
remember.
So he's using very primitive tools, chisels, chains, hoists.
When was
And
this? Like,
this was,
time
I want
period?
to say 1950s,
Okay.
somewhere 50s.
All right.
And so, as Fred said, he's only building at night. And all he would tell people was that he used the secrets of magnetism that the Egyptians used to build the pyramids.
I was going to come back to that when we were talking about the rocks, because I was like, well,
Yes.
wasn't that the same idea as the pyramids? Because we still don't know today how,
Yes.
and Stonehenge and...
Yes.
Okay, all right.
You're exactly right. And at one point, a housing development gets too close to the Coral Castle. So the dude buys new land and moves the entire castle there. And so what he had to do is he had to hire a flatbed truck driver. He ordered the guy to pull up and then leave, and he couldn't see it. So
This is crazy.
the guy sneaks back. The guy sneaks back like an hour later. And he said, the truck driver said, a whole crew of guys, it would take them days to fill it up. Leedskalnin already had the whole truck filled up.
Loaded up.
An hour later. Now, Fred's not wrong. Officially, nobody ever saw him do it. But there's one group of boys that said that they one time snuck through like the dense Florida undergrowth to watch. And they said that this man was actually floating blocks like hot air helium balloons. And he actually has a number of books because, it was a tourist attraction and then he ends up dying. But he has very different takes on mainstream stuff. Like I read his book about the atom and he has a totally different look at the atom. He said the atom, we should think of it actually like an energy pump and mainstream science is wrong. And you say, well, come on, dude. Like how many scientists have proven what the atom's like? But when you look at what this guy does, you really wonder. And just one last story about it. He's so good that the gate to get into the Coral Castle was like an 8-ton block that pivoted on an axle from an automobile. The dude had it so perfectly balanced, you could push it open with one finger. And years after he died, the thing finally broke. It took a whole crew of guys and a huge industrial crane, and it took them an entire day just to get the block out of there so they could fix it. And somehow this little dude did it all by himself.
So this is what I don't understand about our government. We're supposedly as a government doing all these conspiratorial things, or maybe not. Here's a guy that's figured out how to move massive objects with sound.
Right.
Now, why couldn't they? Well, I'm not saying they should have done this, but why didn't they just co-opt this guy, drag him into some experimental complex and make him work out subservient and show us how to do that? I mean, we've done other horrible things to people who
Right.
who have
back
discovered
then,
things, right?
I mean, in the 50s, were they...
Of course.
I'm curious. Well, and so my second question is, does this place still exist?
Yeah, it's a tour site. You can go see it today.
Where?
Coral Gables,
I think it's
Florida.
Coral
What
Gables?
state is it in?
Florida.
Imagine that. It's in Florida.
Floridians have everything.
I think
I'm going
I think
to
it's
Florida
Coral
soon.
Gables. I'm not
going.
positive.
What part of Florida?
Yeah, I'm from Pittsburgh.
He's from Pittsburgh.
Eric, I think to your question, a lot of it is about control. Like, look at who the richest people are in the world today. A lot of them are oil tycoons.
Right.
If Nikola Tesla or Edward Leedskalnin comes up with this breakthrough technology, which the ancients probably knew about, but it's been lost through time, if we come out with that, suddenly we don't need oil, we don't need fossil fuels, and those powerful people are sitting on a resource that's no longer worth anything. To me personally, it comes back to control. And that's also why if you look, did any of you watch the History Channel series on Tesla that was actually... Did you
Yeah, I
see-
watched it.
What was that one called again?
I can't remember. I watch them all and I just sit
Yeah.
down and just...
Well, it was way better than I thought. And it talks about one of his final things, because as brilliant as he was terrible with finances. But he was basically being bankrolled by Westinghouse
Right.
to try to build this energy tower that would wirelessly transmit energy.
right.
But the problem is his investors started to pull out because they realized, oh, wait a minute, if this dude ends up transmitting energy for free, how are we going to make
Right.
money out of this? It was
Right.
called Wardenclyffe.
Right.
And it was on Long Island, and it was only ever partially completed.
Yeah, they never finished it.
Right.
There was a movie about two magicians. It came out about probably
I
15
saw
years,
that. I
15
can't
years
remember
ago.
it
And
either.
they either had Tesla in the movie to some degree, or they were using, because they were doing a magic trick where they disappeared, but through Tesla's wireless energy really made them disappear. And the whole essence of the movie
they both came out at the same time. Both movies. They were about and I cannot.
I watched them both. They were
I
very
watched them
good,
both.
yeah.
I can't remember the names.
Mid 2000s, I think, early
Yeah.
2000s, I think. Yeah. Whew. This is my
definitely gonna have
mind
to do
is
it.
We're
exploding.
do a part
just
two on
starting to
this one.
scratch surfaces.
I know. We're gonna
Definitely.
cover some
This
really
is job
important
security
things.
for us. We're going to be back again. I waited till the end just to, I
know,
kept quiet.
Fred-
Now I'm going to
Fred
start
perked
start scratching and start throwing things out there.
Well, I can't thank you all enough. This is
This
great.
is awesome.
great,
It's a great
yeah.
group.
Jim, and we're going to do this again soon.
Okay.
Yeah.
For sure.
All right.
And it'll take me a week to recover from this mentally.
All of our perceptions have just been really like challenged a lot.
Been red pilled, they say.
I know. Yeah, as the kids say.
I gotta go seek out just some of the reference material, movies and books. Let's go back and what did you say you wanted to bring up? People have
Oh, let's see.
Watchers,
We talked about the Watchers
Watchers.
with Betty Andreasson. We talked about Contact, Whitley Strieber. If you're
Interstellar or
interested,
Communion.
I'm sorry. Yes,
Communion.
Yes, Communion with Whitley Strieber. Contact was
Sagan.
Carl Sagan. If you're interested in remote viewing, we have Sci Spies by Jim Mars. We have Cosmic Voyage by Dr. Courtney Brown. We mentioned The Day After Roswell with Philip Corso and Bill Burns. So a lot of good
stuff.
reading.
Give
Absolutely.
the audience some homework.
Yeah,
All right, I'm going to have to start reading again. Forget YouTube.
All right, friends. Until we see each other reconvene for another episode.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thank you all.
Soon.
We'll see you all. We are out.
Hello, you're listening to the Eric McKenna Project.